The winter that changed everything arrived without warning, the way the worst winters always did. It came down from those northern passes in the second week of November, not gradually, the way folks in Black Creek Ridge were used to, with a few cold nights and frost on the pumpkins, and time to get the last of the livestock sorted before the real chills settled in. This one came sideways, off the high country, dropping 2 feet of snow in 36 hours and sending temperatures down so fast that men who'd spent 30 years on the frontier stood at their windows and looked at each other like they'd never seen snow before. By the end of the first week, 3 homesteads on the eastern side of the valley had already lost cattle. By the end of the second, the creek that ran through the lower settlement had frozen over solid enough to drive a wagon across. The general store on Millbrook Road was running low on kerosene, and Elmer Hatch, who ran the store with his wife Prudence, had already told 4 separate families that he couldn't extend credit past what they already owed. It was into this particular winter, mean, impatient, and uninterested in anyone's circumstances, that the Mercer family arrived. There were 6 of them. Hazel was 28, the oldest, and she was the one driving the wagon when it came down the eastern road into Black Creek Ridge with a broken axle brace and a horse that was clearly too old for the miles it had traveled. Behind her on the wagon bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned and still shivering, sat her mother Edna, 61, and suffering from a cough that had been worsening for 3 weeks. There was Hazel's brother Thomas, 24, his left leg splinted from the knee down after an accident 2 weeks prior involving a falling tree branch and a logging operation that had since closed. Beside him were 3 of Hazel's nephews and nieces, the children of her deceased sister, ranging in age from 6 to 11, watching the strange town come into view with the wide, exhausted eyes of children who have been moving for too long and are past asking when they'll stop. Hazel had $42. She had a crate of kitchen tools, a partial sack of cornmeal, 2 quilts, and a list of practical skills long enough to fill a ledger page. She did not have a plan beyond the immediate next problem, which was getting the wagon to stop rolling long enough for her to assess the damage. She pulled up in front of the livery on Sutton Street and sat there for a moment before she climbed down. A man named Curtis Webb, who was the proprietor of the livery and a talker by nature, came out and looked at her wagon the way people in small towns look at new arrivals, like they're already sorting them into a category. "Axle brace is cracked through," he said, not offering to help. "That's a $3 repair." "I know it's cracked. I drove it 40 miles on it." Hazel climbed down, and she wasn't graceful about it. She was a heavy-set woman, wide through the shoulders and the hips, and the dismount was effortful in the cold. She didn't apologize for it. "What's the going rate for temporary stabling while I get my people somewhere warm?" Curtis Webb looked her over the way he was trying to make it seem like he wasn't. $1 a night. "I've got enough for 3 nights. Is there a boarding house that takes families?" There was a boarding house. It was run by a widow named Gertrude Blanche, and Gertrude Blanche charged a fair rate and didn't ask too many questions, which was partly why Hazel ended up there. The other reason was that one of the Webb livery boys, a 12-year-old named Sam, who had been listening from inside the stable door, came out and told her that Mrs. Blanche sometimes worked out arrangements for families with children, and that she was fair about it, and that information cost Hazel nothing except the half biscuit she had in her coat pocket, which she gave him without ceremony. That first night in the boarding house, Hazel got her mother into a bed with an extra blanket she borrowed from Gertrude Blanche, got the children fed from a soup the woman had on the stove, changed the wrapping on Thomas's leg, and sat down at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown paper and wrote out exactly how much money they had, exactly what they owed, and exactly what they needed to make it through the next 30 days. She crossed things out. She rewrote numbers. She crossed them out again. When she was done, she sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen while everyone else slept, and she did not cry, though she might have been entitled to. What she did instead was make a list of things she could do for money. Gideon Hale found out about the Mercer family the same way he found out about most things. He overheard something he wasn't trying to overhear. He had come into Elmer Hatch's store for tobacco and a coil of rope, and 2 women near the fabric shelf were talking in the way women talk when they know they're being indiscreet and don't particularly care. "She came in here yesterday asking about laundry work," said the first woman, whose name was Marjorie Croft, wife of the largest landowner in the valley. "She looks like she's never done a hard day's work in her life." "Oh, that's not what I heard," said the second, whose name Gideon didn't know. "I heard she's actually quite capable. She's been taking in mending from some of the women near the mill." Well, Marjorie Croft's voice had a particular texture to it, the texture of someone deciding something. "I suppose that's fine for her. Though I will say that brother of hers is laid up, and you have to wonder how long before they're a burden on the settlement's goodwill." Gideon paid for his rope and tobacco and left without entering the conversation. He'd been born in Black Creek Ridge, or close enough to it that it amounted to the same thing. He'd spent the better part of the last 15 years working the high country, running trap lines, guiding hunting parties through the mountains, occasionally hiring out for timber work when he wanted company and cash. He was 34 now, and he'd been on his own long enough that people had stopped expecting him to behave like anyone else. He was a big man, not in the cartoonish way of men who made a show of their size, but in the way of men who had done physical work since they were 12 and had the kind of body that showed it. His face had been weathered by altitude and cold for so long that it was impossible to tell exactly where the character in it ended and the damage began. He had dark eyes and a jaw that didn't particularly soften when he was in polite company, and he walked like a man who was never entirely surprised by his surroundings. He was not considered approachable, and he had never especially tried to be, but something about what Marjorie Croft said bothered him. Not acutely, not in a way he could name immediately. It was the word burden, the easiness of it, the way she'd applied it to a family she clearly knew nothing about, with the lightness of someone who had never been in the position of depending on anyone's goodwill herself. He went back to his cabin on the ridge and didn't think about it further, or tried not to. The thing about a small settlement in winter is that there's nowhere to be invisible. Hazel Mercer learned this within 10 days of arriving. She was not a woman who had ever expected to be the subject of much attention. She'd spent most of her adult life as the practical one, the capable one, the one who got things done without requiring much acknowledgement. She was used to being unremarkable in the way of furniture that serves its purpose without anyone commenting on it. She was not used to being watched and discussed. But in Black Creek Ridge, newcomers were a form of entertainment, and newcomers with visible problems were a particularly rich form. She had taken on laundry work for 3 families by the end of the first week. She was not fast at it initially. The washing conditions were hard, the water cold, her setup improvised. But she was thorough, and by the 3rd delivery, Irene Potts, whose husband ran the mill, told her the shirts had never come back so well pressed. That led to a referral. The referral led to 2 more customers. She also made an arrangement with Gertrude Blanche that involved exchanging labor, cooking, cleaning, maintenance around the boarding house, for reduced board. Gertrude, who was 63 and dealing with her own arthritis, accepted with more warmth than she'd initially let on. Thomas's leg was healing, but slowly. The children needed shoes, and Hazel had the middle boys repaired by a cobbler on Millbrook Road on credit, agreeing to pay it back over 6 weeks. She got the youngest girl enrolled in the settlement schoolhouse by talking to the school teacher, a young woman from the east named Cora Binns, for 45 minutes about what the child already knew and what she needed. None of this was impressive in the way frontier stories usually frame impressive. There was no drama to it. It was just a woman working extremely hard at the grinding logistics of keeping her family alive and not letting anyone see how much it was costing her, except that people saw anyway. Gideon Hale saw her for the first time, properly in the sense of actually registering her, at the end of November. He'd come down from the ridge to pick up supplies and run some business in town, and he was passing the alley beside the boarding house when he heard something that made him stop. Not a voice, a sound. The particular sound of someone moving something heavy and struggling with it, and not making noise about the struggle. He looked around the corner of the building. Hazel Mercer was moving a waterlogged barrel that had frozen to the ground and needed to be repositioned before it cracked through. She was alone, it was below freezing, and she had clearly been at this for a few minutes already. Her boots were inadequate for the temperature. She had a piece of old leather wrapped around her hands in lieu of proper gloves. She got the barrel loose on the 3rd try. It came free with a sound like a cork pulled from a bottle, and the momentum nearly knocked her sideways into the wall. But she caught herself, reset her grip, and walked it to where she needed it. Then she stood up straight and exhaled a cloud of vapor into the cold air and rolled her neck once like she was working out a kink, and then she went back inside. Gideon stood at the corner of the building for a moment after she was gone. He didn't know what he'd expected to see, But what he'd seen was someone who had not one person watching, no one to admire the effort or acknowledge the difficulty, and she had done the work anyway, fully, without complaint, and without any apparent expectation that the world owed her recognition for it. He went and bought his supplies and didn't say anything to anyone. December. The cold deepened. Thomas Mercer's leg wasn't healing the way it should. A traveling physician named Avery Cole came through Black Creek Ridge for 3 days in early December and examined it at Hazel's request. He charged $4 for the visit. He told her Thomas had developed a low-grade infection in the bone and would need to stay off it for at least another 2 months or risk something worse, and that he needed specific medicines that were not cheap. Hazel listened to everything he said. She asked him to repeat the part about the medicines, and she wrote it down. Then she went to the general store, found out the medicines would cost $6, and stood in front of the store counter for a long moment. "You all right?" Elmer Hatch asked her. "Yes," she said. And then, "Do you need anything done around here? I can keep books, I can do inventory, I can do whatever you need that doesn't require me to be fast at it." Elmer Hatch scratched the back of his neck. He looked at her for a second. "You know figures?" "I was keeping my father's accounts by the time I was 14. He hired her for 3 hours a week, cash on delivery. It covered the medicine over 2 weeks. Thomas got worse before he got better, the way infections do. There were 4 nights in December where Hazel sat up with him in the back room of the boarding house, keeping the compress changed, watching his face for the specific quality of fever that meant things were going wrong. The children slept. Her mother slept. Thomas sweat through 2 sets of linens and talked in his sleep about things she didn't recognize. She sat there and kept watch and didn't sleep and was back at the washtub by 7 in the morning. Nobody in Black Creek Ridge knew she was doing any of this, or almost nobody. Gideon Hale was not a man who made a habit of paying attention to other people's private lives. He had built his own around the specific pleasure of not being entangled with anyone else's complications. But there was a quality to the winter that year, or maybe it was something else, that kept pulling his attention toward the Mercer family in ways he couldn't quite account for. He heard about the brothers' infection through Sam Webb, the livery boy, who heard it from the boarding house and was the kind of kid who talked. He heard about the medicine situation from Elmer Hatch himself, who mentioned it in a general way when Gideon was in the store and said something about how the Mercer woman was making ends meet in ways that would embarrass most men he knew, which was the closest Elmer Hatch ever came to a compliment. He saw her once more in December, at a distance. She was walking from the boarding house to the general store with one of the Mercer children beside her, the youngest girl, who was wearing a too large coat that had clearly been altered to fit her. The girl was asking something and Hazel was answering, and whatever she said made the girl laugh. Genuine, unguarded child's laughter, in the middle of a hard winter, on a street where most people looked beaten down by the cold. Hazel Mercer was smiling when the girl laughed. Not the kind of smile people produced when they wanted to seem fine. The real kind, quick and unperformed, before it faded back to the careful expression she wore the rest of the time. It lodged somewhere behind his sternum and declined to move. He told himself this was nothing. He was 34 years old and he'd lived alone by choice for 15 years, and he was not a man who went soft over a woman's smile in a December street. He was in the general store 3 days later, asking Elmer Hatch, with his back half turned and his voice as neutral as he could make it, whether the Mercer family had enough firewood to get through the rest of the season. Elmer Hatch looked at him with the specific expression of a man who was not going to say what he was thinking. "Don't know," he said. "Could ask." "I'm not asking her," Gideon said. Elmer Hatch's expression didn't change. I'm just noting that the north-facing rooms in that boarding house don't hold heat worth a damn." "I'll mention it to Gertrude," Elmer said. Gideon bought his supplies and left. He dropped 3/4 of a cord of split firewood at the back of the boarding house the next morning before dawn, stacked it against the wall, and was back on the ridge before anyone was awake. Christmas came and went quietly. Hazel used what she had to make something reasonable for the children. She made a soup that took all day. She found a second-hand toy horse at a neighbor's sale and cleaned it up for the youngest boy. She stayed cheerful in front of everyone and didn't let anyone see the list of numbers in her head that kept rearranging themselves in ways that refused to add up comfortably. What she didn't know was that the three families she did laundry for had, without discussing it with each other, each given their December payment slightly early. She noticed, but she didn't know why. She thought maybe it was generosity of the season. She was grateful for it in a way that was almost painful. What she also didn't know was that Gideon Hale had said something to Irene Potts's husband in passing. Nothing direct, nothing anyone could quote exactly, about how the Mercer family was running a tight month. Seth Potts was not a generous man by disposition, but he was a fair one, and he'd told his wife, and Irene Potts had taken care of it in the way women in small settlements sometimes took care of things without making an announcement. Gideon didn't do this to be seen. He did it because the numbers, as he understood them from what he'd pieced together, were wrong, and he had the means to make them slightly less wrong, and he'd made the decision the same way he made most decisions, quietly, without consulting anyone, and without expecting acknowledgement. January. Thomas was on his feet again, slowly, with a stick, but upright. He'd started doing small tasks around the boarding house to offset costs. Edna, their mother, was doing better. Gertrude Blanche had taken to her, and they'd struck up a genuine friendship of the kind old women sometimes do, blunt and without ceremony. The children were settled into a routine. The oldest nephew, who was 11 and named Will, had started helping Sam Webb at the livery after school in exchange for small amounts of cash he handed over to Hazel without being asked. Hazel had picked up a fourth laundry customer and had negotiated a small regular arrangement with the school teacher to help cover school supplies for the children in exchange for some bookkeeping work. She was managing, not comfortably, not without cost, but managing. It was in January that she started to become aware of Gideon Hale, not as a name she'd heard around town, but as a specific person who seemed to be present in peripheral ways she couldn't quite account for. She'd seen him twice at a distance, once outside the general store, once on the far side of Millbrook Road. And both times she'd had the distinct sense that he'd been watching her, though whenever she looked directly at him, he was looking at something else. She asked Gertrude Blanche about him. Gertrude Blanche's expression was complicated. "Gideon Hale," she said, in the tone of someone beginning an explanation they weren't sure how to organize. "He's from here, originally. Parents died when he was young. He went to the high country and came back a different kind of man. He traps, guides, does work for himself, keeps to himself." "Is he the one who left the firewood?" Gertrude Blanche didn't look at her. "Can't say. Because no one told me, and that's not a thing that happened by accident." "I genuinely can't say," Gertrude said, which was a different statement than she'd made the first time. Hazel thought about that for a while. The first time they actually spoke was in February. She was at Elmer Hatch's store in the early morning before many people were about, picking up the weekly orders she'd set aside. Gideon Hale came in while she was at the counter. He was larger in close proximity than he'd seemed at a distance. He had the kind of presence that adjusted the dimensions of a room slightly. He nodded at Elmer, and then his gaze settled on Hazel briefly. Not intrusively, but directly, in the way of someone who didn't bother to pretend they hadn't noticed you. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He went to the back of the store for something. Elmer Hatch watched this exchange with a face arranged in careful neutrality. Hazel finished her transaction and picked up her parcels. She was at the door when she heard the voice behind her, not loud, not particularly directed at her, but audible. "The barrel you moved back in November. The frozen one. The hinge on the door catch beside it is rusted through. It'll give in a hard wind." She turned around. Gideon Hale was at the back counter, not looking at her, arranging something in his coat. "You saw that," she said. "Happened to be passing." She regarded him for a moment. There was nothing in his face that was trying to ingratiate itself with her. He wasn't performing helpfulness. He was simply noting a fact he thought she should have. "I'll tell Gertrude," she said. "Already did," he said. 2 weeks ago. She hasn't gotten to it." Hazel let a beat pass. "Thank you for the firewood," she said. He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Don't know what you're talking about." "Fine," she said. She left. Standing on the wooden sidewalk outside with the cold February air against her face, she was aware of something she hadn't felt in long enough that it took her a second to name it. Not attraction exactly, not yet. something simpler than that. The sensation of being seen by someone who wasn't keeping a ledger of it. February into March. They spoke 4 more times. None of the conversations were long. None of them were, by any obvious measure, significant. They spoke about the weather, about the road conditions on the Eastern Pass, about a dispute involving 2 neighboring homesteads that had become settlement gossip. What made those conversations different from conversations Hazel had with other people in Black Creek Ridge was that Gideon Hale never said anything he didn't mean, and he never said anything to make himself look good inside it. She told him once, in passing, that the school teacher was struggling with the older children who'd stopped coming since the cold. He said, "What do they need?" She said, "Something that makes school feel worth the walk." He said, "The schoolhouse has no good maps. Kids who grew up on the frontier, you show them a real map of where they are. They get interested." 2 weeks later, there were 3 large surveyor's maps on the schoolhouse wall. Cora Binns didn't know where they'd come from. Hazel knew. She didn't say anything to him about it, but something shifted between them. Some quiet understanding that they were, without having declared it, paying attention to the same things. Well, spring was still weeks away when the first whispers started. It began the way these things always begin in small settlements. Someone noticed something, mentioned it to someone else, and by the time the observation had passed through 5 different mouths, it had acquired a quality it didn't originally have. What people noticed was that Gideon Hale, who had never paid any particular attention to women in Black Creek Ridge, was paying attention to Hazel Mercer. This was not, in itself, a problem. Except that Black Creek Ridge had certain expectations about Gideon Hale, and those expectations, though no one had ever stated them directly to him, or would have dared, involved someone considerably more in line with what the Valley considered appropriate. Marjorie Croft, whose daughter Eleanor was 22 and fair-haired and had been raised to be exactly the kind of woman a man of Gideon's standing should want, was the first one to voice the opinion that something was irregular. "He's being polite," her husband said when she raised it. "He's not a polite man," Marjorie said. "That's the point." Eleanor Croft, for her part, had never shown any particular interest in Gideon Hale as a man. She found him somewhat alarming, if she was honest. But the fact of him choosing to notice someone else, and specifically someone who was not Eleanor Croft, had produced in the Croft household a particular quality of offense that had nothing to do with Eleanor's actual feelings. That was how it always started. So, what the whispers settled on, eventually, was a version of events that was built almost entirely out of the shape of things, with very little regard for the actual substance. The version was that Hazel Mercer, a woman with no land and no money, and a family full of dependents, had made a calculated decision to attract Gideon Hale's attention. That she was clever about it. Not forward, not obvious, but strategic. That she manufactured situations where he would see her being capable in order to pull at whatever instinct in him would respond to that. This version was discussed in the Croft parlor, at the Hatch store counter, at the church social, and in the back room of the dry goods establishment on the corner of Sutton and Mill. It spread the way flattering lies about capable women always spread, quickly and with the confidence of people who had decided what they were looking at before they'd finished looking. Nobody asked Hazel what she was doing. Nobody asked Gideon either, but that was different. Nobody asked Gideon anything he didn't want to answer, which was most things. Hazel heard the whispers in March. Not all at once. In pieces. The way you hear something you've been half expecting. A woman she did laundry for was suddenly unavailable when she came for pickup. The woman's neighbor, who had been on the list for new laundry work, told her apologetically that she'd decided to manage on her own. At the general store, Elmer Hatch was his usual self, but 2 women near the counter went quiet when Hazel came in, and she was not so unaware of the world that she missed the shape of that quiet. Thomas noticed before she said anything. He was sharper than his leg let him look these days. "Something's going on," he said one evening. He was sitting at the boarding house table with the legs stretched out, which was as comfortable as he could get. "People talk," Hazel said. She was mending one of the children's shirts under the lamp. "They're talking about you and Hale." She kept her eyes on the mending. "Are they? Are they wrong? About what?" Thomas looked at her. He was 24, which was young enough that he'd retained the quality of asking questions directly. "About whether there's something between you." Hazel set the shirt down. She looked at her brother, who was looking back at her with the specific expression of someone who loved her and was also not going to pretend. "He's a good man," she said, which was not an answer to the question Thomas had asked. "He also has half the valley watching him like he's their property," Thomas said. "If this is what I think it is, it's going to cost you." "I know," she said. "Do you?" "Thomas." He held his hands up. "One concession. Just making sure you've thought about it." "I've thought about everything," she said. "I've been thinking about everything since we got here. It's all I do." She picked the shirt back up. After a moment, Thomas let it go. What she hadn't said, because there wasn't a way to say it without it sounding like more than she knew it to be yet, was that the whispers didn't change how she felt when Gideon Hale looked at her like she was a person. Not a woman who needed managing or pitying or positioning. A person, specific and complete, whose choices he followed with his attention the way you'd follow something that genuinely interested you. She had not had that, from anyone, in longer than she could clearly remember. That was worth something. Whether it was worth what it was going to cost her was a question she hadn't answered yet. The last weeks of winter. The snow was still on the ground when Gideon came down from the ridge on an errand and found Hazel in a situation that told him more than any conversation had. One of the laundry accounts she'd lost, the wife of a merchant named Doyle, had apparently complained to her husband, who had apparently said something to someone, and the result was that one of the mill workers was loudly claiming at the tavern that the Mercer woman had been spreading false stories about the Doyle household to garner sympathy. This was not true. Hazel had never said a word about the Doyle household to anyone except Gertrude Blanche, and what she'd said was minimal and private. But the mill worker was repeating it, and the story was growing, and when Gideon walked past the tavern and heard his name mentioned in the same sentence as Hazel's and the word scheme, he stopped walking. He stood outside the tavern for a moment. His jaw was doing something specific that people who knew him recognized as a bad sign. Then he walked away. Not because he was letting it go, because he was the kind of man who didn't act in public when he was too angry to act carefully. He found Hazel that afternoon at the edge of the boarding house property, splitting kindling she didn't technically need to split. She just needed something to do with her hands. He knew that feeling. She looked up when she heard him approach. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question. "Most of it," he said. She set the hatchet down. She looked tired in a way she usually managed to hide. "I didn't say anything about the Doyle family. Whatever they're saying, I said." "I know," he said. "You know." "Yes." He said it like it was obvious, like the idea that she might have done what they were saying was a thing that hadn't required serious consideration. She looked at him steadily. "How do you know?" He was quiet for a second. Then, "Because I've been watching how you operate since November. And the way you operate doesn't include running your mouth about people who might still be useful to you." It was not a romantic thing to say. It was the kind of thing you said about someone you'd actually been paying attention to. "That's a very practical reason," she said. "I'm a practical person." She picked up the hatchet again. "They're going to keep talking," she said. "Let them." That's easier to say when it's not your laundry accounts disappearing. "Fair," he said. She looked at him from the corner of her eye. "Are you going to do something about it?" "I'm going to say something," he said, "to one or two people. Something that makes it clear the story doesn't hold up." "Gideon." She said his name for the first time with familiarity, and he noticed. "If you do that, it's going to make it worse. For me." "Why?" "Because then it becomes a story about why you're defending me, and that story is worse than the one they're already telling." He thought about that. He didn't like it, but he thought about it seriously, which was all she'd asked for. "Then what do you want me to do?" he asked. She split the piece of wood she was holding, clean through, 2 even pieces. She looked at the result for a second. "Nothing," she said. "I'm going to handle it myself. It helps to know someone thinks I'm telling the truth." He looked at her for a moment in the fading winter light, with the cold still in the air and the mud of late February under their boots, and something in his expression settled into a particular quality she hadn't seen from him before. "You're telling the truth," he said. "And you're better at this, all of this, than any of them are going to admit." She didn't say anything. The wind moved through the bare trees at the property line. "Come spring," he said, and then stopped. "What?" "Come spring. I'd like to take you somewhere. Just to show you something on the ridge. Nothing that requires..." He paused again. He was better at silence than speech, she'd noticed, but right now speech was the thing he was working at. It's not a thing I show many people. Hazel Mercer stood in the cold mud of late February and looked at a man she hadn't expected, in a place she hadn't expected to be, and something that had been tight in her chest for a very long time made the smallest, most careful movement toward loosening. "Come spring," she said. March came in hard and then broke. The snow pulled back from the valley floor first, and then the upper meadows, and the mud season began, that wet, brown, unglamorous stretch that the frontier didn't mention in its stories about itself. Thomas was walking without the stick now, mostly. He'd found work helping a carpenter named Royce, who needed someone who could measure and think, but couldn't do anything that required two fully functional legs. It was reasonable money, and it gave him back something he'd been losing. Edna, their mother, had good weeks and bad weeks. The good ones were good enough that Hazel could sometimes see the woman her mother had been before the losses accumulated. The children were growing. Will, the 11-year-old, had started reading books from the schoolhouse that he brought home and left on the table for Hazel to look at, without comment. She read them. It was the closest either of them came to saying something they both felt. Black Creek Ridge watched all of this with the attention it gave everything it didn't fully understand. And the whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd organized themselves into something more deliberate, less idle gossip, more a sustained campaign of small discouragements, the kind that don't look like anything individually, but add up to a wall. What the Valley didn't know yet was that the wall was not going to hold. What the Valley didn't know was that Gideon Hale had made a decision. He hadn't told anyone yet. He didn't operate by announcement, but he'd made it, and in the way of things made by people who actually intend to follow through, it was already as good as done. Checky. Spring came the way it always does. Not all at once, not with fanfare. Just gradually less cold, and then suddenly green, and then you were in it before you'd entirely prepared for it. One morning in early April, Gideon Hale came down from the ridge to the settlement and walked directly to the boarding house on Sutton Street and knocked on the door. Gertrude Blanche answered. She looked at him. She looked at the direction of the back hallway. She stepped aside without a word. Hazel came out drying her hands on a cloth. She saw him and went still for a second. He had his hat in his hand. He was, she noticed, wearing a clean shirt. "The Ridge," he said. "If you want to come." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Gertrude Blanche at the edge of her peripheral vision, probably having the best morning she'd had in some time. "Let me get my coat," Hazel said. The walk up the Eastern Trail was an hour. He didn't talk much on the way up. He never did. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they're both paying attention to the same landscape. The ridge itself was extraordinary. She'd seen mountains before, but from below, where they were walls. Up here, she could see the whole of the valley. Black Creek Ridge laid out small and geometric and manageable from above, the creek running silver through the center of it, the squares of homestead land like a quilt. "I used to come up here," he said, standing beside her, looking at it, "when the settlement felt like too much." "Did it often feel like too much?" "Sometimes." He paused. "I'm not easy to be around. I know that." She didn't argue with it or soften it. "You're more honest than most people." That's one way to say it. They stood there for a while. The valley was quiet from this distance. "They're going to say things about this," she said. "Not bitterly, just accounting for it." "I know. And you're still here." "I'm still here." He turned slightly to look at her. "I want to know if you're willing to—" He stopped. He looked back at the valley for a second, like he was checking something against a question. "I'm not asking you to make any kind of decision today. I'm not asking you to say anything in particular. I just need to know if this," he gestured in his imprecise way at the space between them, "is something you think is worth considering." Hazel Mercer looked out over the valley that had spent 4 months trying to convince her she was less than what she knew herself to be. She thought about the barrel in the frozen alley, the firewood she hadn't asked for, the maps on the schoolhouse wall, the way he'd said "you're telling the truth" with no ceremony and no explanation, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Yes," she said. "I think it's worth considering." He nodded. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face changed. A small, private thing that she suspected most people never saw and he'd never described to anyone. Below them, the valley was going about its business. It didn't know yet what was coming, neither did they, entirely. But they were standing on the ridge together in the early spring light, and the rest of it, the whispers, the walls, the long arithmetic of survival, would wait until they came back down. They came down from the ridge in the early afternoon, and by the time Hazel's boots hit the flat ground of Sutton Street, she could feel the change in the air. Not a physical thing. The spring day was mild, the mud had dried to something manageable on the main road, and the settlement was going about its ordinary business. But there was a quality to the way two women outside the dry goods store stopped talking when she passed that told her something had moved while she was gone. She was not surprised. She'd told Gideon this would happen. What she hadn't accounted for, because she was good at accounting for things, but not infallible at it, was how fast. Gertrude Blanche was in the kitchen when Hazel came back in, and she looked up with the expression of someone who had been waiting but was going to make a show of not having been waiting. She set a cup of coffee on the table without being asked. "Well?" she said. "Well?" Hazel said. She sat down. The coffee was too hot, but she wrapped her hands around the cup anyway. "Curtis Webb's wife saw you leave with him this morning," Gertrude said. She was not being unkind about it. She was being practical, which was her particular form of care. "And saw you come back." "I figured." "She went to Marjorie Croft's house before noon." Hazel exhaled slowly through her nose. "How do you know that?" "Because Sam told his mother where you'd gone, and his mother told me, and I know which direction news travels in this settlement." Gertrude sat down across from her. She was 63, and she'd been in Black Creek Ridge for 31 years. And the thing about women who have lived somewhere that long is that they understand the architecture of a community's gossip the way a builder understands walls, where the load-bearing points are, what can be moved, and what will bring something down. "The Crofts are going to make noise," she said. "I know." "Eleanor Croft has been—" "I know," Hazel said again. "Eleanor Croft doesn't actually want Gideon Hale. She wants the idea that he might have wanted her." Gertrude looked at her for a moment. "You're right about that. Doesn't make her family less dangerous." "No, it doesn't." They sat for a while with the coffee and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and Hazel thought about the ridge, about the valley laid out below them, like something containable, the creek running through it, the homestead squares. She thought about the way Gideon had said yes. I think it's worth considering, repeating her words back to her quietly, like he was glad she'd said them. She thought about whether she was making a mistake. She thought she probably wasn't, but she was aware that the person most likely to be wrong about that was herself. "I have laundry to finish," she said, and stood up. The campaign, and it was a campaign, even if no one called it that, began in earnest the second week of April. It didn't look like a campaign. It never did, in small settlements. It looked like a series of unrelated events, each individually explainable, each individually small enough to dismiss if you were inclined to dismiss things. The Doyle family, who'd already stopped the laundry arrangement, started a story, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, that Hazel had been dishonest about what they owed her. A woman named Frances Tilbury, who had no particular quarrel with Hazel that Hazel knew of, mentioned at a church social that she'd heard the Mercer family had arrived in Black Creek Ridge under circumstances that weren't entirely what they'd claimed. The specific circumstances were never named. They didn't need to be. The implication was the architecture, not any particular brick. Hazel's fourth laundry customer, a young wife named Pearl Sadler, came to her in the second week of April with an apology she couldn't quite look Hazel in the face while delivering. Her husband had asked her to stop. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. 3 customers. She sat with the numbers that night, and they still added up. Barely, but the margin had narrowed again. The margin was always narrowing. She'd gotten used to living just inside it, and she knew how to do that. But she'd also gotten used to the idea, cautiously, privately, that the margin might eventually widen. That hope was a thing she'd let herself feel on the ridge in the early spring light, and it turned out hope was more expensive than she'd budgeted for. Thomas saw the laundry numbers and set his jaw in a way that reminded her of their father. "Tell me who," he said. "No." "Hazel." What are you going to do, Thomas? You're still 3 weeks from full weight on that leg, and you've got a job you can't afford to lose. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was angry and knew she was right. Royce said something today, he said eventually, about the Hale situation. She looked at him, not unkindly. He said he thought Gideon Hale was a straight man, and he didn't put much stock in gossip. But he said the people backing the gossip have influence, and that influence usually wins. Usually, she said. He didn't mean it as encouragement. I know. She closed the account book. Get some sleep. 1. Gideon knew what was happening. He didn't need anyone to tell him. He'd lived in Black Creek Ridge his whole life in the particular way of a man who stands at the edges of things and sees more than the people in the center. He knew the Croft family's specific brand of influence, quiet, persistent, and exercised through the mechanisms of social approval that men like Crawford Croft controlled without ever touching directly. Crawford Croft owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. He sat on the settlement's informal council, the group of 6 men who made decisions about roads, water rights, and disputes that were technically voluntary to follow, but practically not. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was a man who made certain conversations happen in certain rooms and then waited for the results. Gideon had had one conversation with Crawford Croft in the past decade about a property line dispute that involved neither of them directly, and he'd come away from it with the clear impression that Croft was the kind of man who experienced other people's choices as personal affronts when those choices didn't align with his interests. He hadn't particularly cared then. He cared now in the way you care about a thing when it's being directed at someone else. He came into town in the 3rd week of April and went to see Elmer Hatch, because Elmer Hatch was genuinely neutral in a way that was increasingly rare, and because he was one of the few people Gideon would speak to directly about something that mattered. Elmer was in the back sorting inventory. He heard Gideon come in and said, without turning around, "You're going to ask me about the Mercer situation." "I'm going to ask you what you know," Gideon said. Elmer turned around. He was 57, balding, with the expression of a man who'd operated a general store long enough to have heard everything at least twice. "I know that Crawford Croft had a conversation with Seth Potts last week that resulted in Seth Potts reconsidering whether he wanted to do business with anyone connected to the Mercer family." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Connected. That's the word he used. That includes me. I'd imagine that was the point." Elmer set down the box he was holding. "Seth came in here yesterday and bought considerably less than usual. Didn't say anything directly, didn't have to." Gideon thought about this. He wasn't surprised by it. He'd expected pressure. He just hadn't expected it to move toward his business interests this quickly. Crawford Croft was more motivated than he'd calculated. "What else?" he said. "There's a story going around about how the Mercer woman is running some kind of scheme, that she targeted you specifically because of your land holdings and your name, that the whole helpless family thing is calculated." Elmer's voice was flat reporting, not endorsement. "You should know that most of the people repeating it don't actually believe it. They're repeating it because the people who started it have more social currency than the Mercers do. And it's easier to repeat something than to push back." "That's a cowardly way to behave," Gideon said. "Yes." Elmer didn't argue the point. "It's also an ordinary one." Gideon stood in the store and looked at a spot on the floor for a moment. "She's losing customers," he said. "I know." "She's not doing anything wrong." "I know that too." "Then the people helping spread this know it's wrong." Elmer looked at him carefully. "Gideon, what exactly are you thinking about doing?" "I don't know yet." He picked up the items he'd come for. "Something. Something that makes things worse for her, or something that actually helps?" Gideon looked at him. Elmer held up one hand. "I'm not questioning your intentions. I'm noting that those are two different things, and they don't always look different from the outside until it's too late to tell them apart." It was the most useful thing anyone said to Gideon Hale in the entire month of April, and he thought about it for 3 days afterward. He came to find Hazel on a Tuesday evening. She was on the boarding house porch doing the kind of mending that didn't actually require full concentration. The kind you did so your hands were busy while your mind worked through something else. She looked up when she heard his boots on the step, and her face did a brief thing, gone almost immediately, that told him she was relieved to see him and wasn't sure she wanted him to know that. He sat down on the step, not on the chair she'd have given him, just on the step, where he could face partly away from her and partly toward her, the way he always positioned himself when something was difficult. Crawford Croft talked to Seth Potts, he said. I figured, she said. She kept the mending going. About your business arrangements? About whether associating with people associated with me was a good idea for commerce. Her hand slowed for a moment, then resumed. He went after your income. Tried to. It won't amount to much for me. He paused. But it tells me what he's willing to do. He's willing to do whatever it takes to make this inconvenient enough that you walk away, she said. Her voice was matter of fact. Not angry, not wounded, just accounting for it. And if you walk away, I'm back to being no one, and the whole thing goes quiet. I'm not walking away. She looked at him then, steady, checking the statement. I need you to understand what staying looks like from where I'm standing, she said. I've lost one customer this week. I'm going to lose more. The story about me scheming is picking up. My brother is worried about his job. My mother doesn't know the half of it, and I'd like to keep it that way. This is going to get worse before it levels off, if it levels off. I know. And I'm not asking you to fix it, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not... She stopped, set the mending down for a second, and pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. It was the first time he'd seen her acknowledge fatigue without immediately covering it. I'm not someone who fell into hardship and needs a man to pull her out of it. That's what they're saying about me, and it's not true, and I need you to understand it's not true. I understand it's not true, he said, simply, like it required no effort to believe. Then what are you here for? Not hostile, genuinely asking. He thought about it honestly. I'm here because I don't like what's being done to you, and I'm trying to figure out the right way to push back that doesn't make it worse. He looked at the street. And because I want to be here. I'm not good at explaining that part. The porch was quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog was making noise about something. You could talk to Crawford Croft, she said. I've thought about it. And talking to Crawford Croft directly tells him I'm rattled, and that he succeeded in making this about a confrontation between him and me, which is a fight he's positioned to win because he has more to threaten me with than I want to deal with publicly right now. She tilted her head. What does he have? Gideon was quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable. A dispute about water rights on my Upper Ridge property. It's been managed by private agreement for years. If he decides to make it a legal matter, it gets expensive and complicated. He'd do that? He'd do exactly that, and he'd do it with a smile. Hazel was quiet too then. She picked up the mending again. So he has leverage. Some. And you haven't mentioned this before because it's my problem to manage, and I didn't want you thinking you needed to back away from this in order to protect my property interests. He said this with the specific awkwardness of a man who was not used to explaining his reasons to anyone. Which is also why I'm telling you now. I don't want you making decisions without information. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. That's a strange way to manage a water rights dispute, she said finally. I'm a strange person. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but something in that vicinity. I've noticed, she said. May arrived, and with it the full mess of the spring campaign season. Planting, fence repairs, the annual argument about the creek's irrigation allocation, the general sense of a community that had been closed in on itself all winter, finally expanding back into something that required managing. Hazel had cut their household expenses to the point where she couldn't find much else to cut. She'd picked up a new piece of work, helping Cora Binns organize the schoolhouse records and correspondence for a small weekly fee. And she'd made an arrangement with a homesteader's wife named Ruth Dunbar, who lived 3 miles east of town and needed reliable laundry done, and either didn't know or didn't care what people were saying about the Mercer woman. Ruth Dunbar was 68 and had the general attitude of someone who had outlived most of the opinions other people had about her and had no intention of adopting new ones. Marjorie Croft, Ruth said to Hazel one afternoon, watching her work, has never done a thing in her life that her husband didn't arrange for her. Don't let her tell you who you are. Hazel wrung out a shirt and said nothing. I mean it, Ruth said. I believe you, Hazel said. You don't look like you believe anything good is coming. Hazel hung the shirt. I believe some good things are coming, she said. I just know better than to count on it before it arrives. Ruth made a sound that might have been approval. Fair enough, she said. Come inside when you're done. I made a pie that's better than it looks, and it looks fine. It was, Hazel thought, one of the better afternoons she'd had in a while. What? The worst week was the second week of May. It started with Thomas. He came home on a Wednesday with a face that was doing the careful nothing that meant something had happened. He sat down at the table and told her that Royce, the carpenter, had been approached by two of his regular clients and told, politely, obliquely, in the way of these things, that they were uncertain about maintaining a business relationship with a shop that employed someone connected to the Mercer family situation. Royce had not fired Thomas. He told Thomas directly because he was a man who operated by direct statement that the conversations had happened and that he was not inclined to respond to social pressure, but that Thomas should know the landscape. He kept me on, Thomas said, but he might lose business over it. Is he likely to let that change his decision? Hazel asked. He said no. Thomas paused. I believe him, but it means staying at his shop costs him. She sat down across from him. The evening light was long and slanted through the window. Are you thinking about leaving? If it was just me, no. He looked at her. But Royce doesn't deserve to lose business because we're here. Thomas, if you leave that job because of pressure they put on your employer, they've won something, and they'll know it, and they'll do it again. He was quiet for a moment. I know. He ran a hand over his face. I just hate that other people are paying for this. Other people paying for other people's decisions is usually how power works, she said. The point is not to give them the satisfaction of seeing it move us. He looked at her. He was her younger brother, but in the lamplight, just for a moment, she thought he looked older than she remembered. You're doing okay? He asked. Not about the money. She could tell the difference. Some days, she said. Not always. He nodded, didn't push it. The children were asleep. Their mother was in the back room doing better this week than last. Thomas poured himself a small glass of something and pushed the bottle toward her. And she thought about it and took a small amount too, which was not something she usually did. They sat together in the quiet like two people who had grown up in the same house and understood the specific shape of silence between siblings who'd been through difficult things. Tell me it's worth it, he said. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I think it might be. He drank his glass. That's good enough, he said. For now. What happened on the third Thursday of May, nobody had planned. Hazel had walked to the east end of Millbrook Road to pick up thread from a woman who sold dry goods out of her home. And on the way back, she cut through the alley beside the mill because it was shorter and she was running late. She heard voices before she saw anyone. Two women she recognized as part of Marjorie Croft's particular social circle, talking in the way people talk when they think they're not overheard. She recognized her own name before she'd processed much else. Honestly, don't know how she has the nerve to still be here. The whole family is a drain, and she's managed to attach herself to Gideon Hale like, well, he's been seen with her twice this week, in public, like he wants people to see it. Maybe he does. Then he's lost his senses. She's got nothing. She'll never have anything. She's using him for stability, and he's too proud to see it. Hazel stopped walking. She stood in the alley for a moment. The rational thing, the thing she'd have told Thomas to do in the same situation, was to keep walking. Keep walking. Don't give them the shape of your reaction. Don't make a scene that becomes part of the story they're already telling about you. She kept walking. She didn't stop in front of them, didn't confront them, didn't say a word. She turned out of the alley and onto the main street and walked at exactly the same pace she'd been walking before. Her jaw was tight enough that it ached. She walked 3 blocks before she stopped and stood in front of the livery and breathed through it. The tight jaw, the anger that wanted somewhere to go and didn't have a good place, the exhaustion of being talked about by people who didn't know her, who had decided what she was and were not interested in any evidence that contradicted it. She's using him for stability. What made it worse was not that the accusation was cruel. She'd expected cruelty. What made it worse was the specific cruelty of it, the targeted accuracy of attacking the exact thing she'd been most careful about. She had been scrupulously, consciously, almost painfully careful not to need anything from Gideon Hale. She'd told him she wasn't looking for rescue. She'd made a point of it, And the story being told about her was exactly the story she'd most tried not to give anyone reason to tell. She thought about the ridge, the valley below, the way he'd said something that makes it clear the story doesn't hold up, and the way she'd told him that would make things worse, and the way she'd been right about that. She thought about what it cost to be right and to be losing ground anyway. Sam Webb came out of the livery and nearly walked into her.
"Sorry," he said.
Then he looked at her. He was 12 now, and he'd been watching this family all winter with the particular awareness of a child who pays more attention than the adults around him know. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her the way children do when they know you're lying but know it's not their place to say so. "Your horse is doing well," she said, because she knew he'd been worried about the old roan in stable 3. His face opened up. "Eating normal again since last week." "Good," she said, and that was enough for both of them. She walked on. She didn't tell Gideon about the alley conversation. It wasn't his to carry. But he found out the way he found out things, and he came to the boarding house on Friday afternoon with a quality about him that she'd learned to read by now. A stillness that was not relaxed, the kind that meant something was in motion behind it. "You heard," she said. Third time she'd said those words to him. "Yes." "From who?" "Does it matter?" "Not really." She was at the table with the accounts. She closed the book. "It's fine, Gideon." "It's not fine." "I know it's not fine. I'm handling it." He sat down across from her. He had his hands on the table, flat, the way he sat when he was making himself be still instead of doing something. "I want to say something publicly," he said. "At the spring gathering at the end of the month. There's going to be most of the valley there, ranchers, merchants, homesteaders. I want to say something." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes clear where I stand, not defending you against specific accusations. That just lends the accusations weight. The kind that makes it obvious what this is and who we are, and makes the people doing this have to look at it directly." "That's..." She pressed her lips together. "Gideon, that's a very large thing." "I know." "You understand what you're declaring at an event like that, in front of that many people?" "Yes." "And you've thought about it?" "I've thought about very little else for 2 weeks," he said, which was the most he'd ever admitted to thinking about her, and they both knew it. She got up. She went to the window and looked out at the street, at the ordinary business of the settlement going about itself as it always did, regardless of anything happening in the lives of the people inside the buildings. She stood there for a moment. "If you do this," she said, "it becomes something there's no quiet version of. The crofts escalate. The water rights thing. I know. And you're willing to take that on." "I'm willing." He paused. "What I need to know is whether you're willing, because if you're not, if this is too much, if you want to stay quiet and see if this passes on its own, I'll stay quiet too. This is your life here, more than it's mine. I can go back to the ridge and it doesn't change much for me. For you, it changes everything." She turned around from the window. He was sitting at her kitchen table with his hands flat and his face open in the way it only got when he was being completely honest about something, and she thought about what it had taken to be this person, to sit this still, to ask the question this directly, to leave the door fully open for her to say no. "I'm willing," she said. Something in his shoulders settled, just slightly. "It's going to be a scene," she said. "Probably. People are going to say things." "Let them." She almost laughed. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He stood up. He looked at her across the table with the specific look she'd been collecting and cataloging since February, adding each one to something she hadn't named yet because she didn't have a word for it that wasn't either too small or too much. "Whatever they say, they're going to have to look at what we actually are and decide what to do with it. And I think most of them, when they have to look directly, won't find much to stand on." "You have more faith in people than I do," she said. "I have less," he said. "That's how I know they'll fold when it costs them something." The days between that conversation and the spring gathering were strange ones. Strange in the way of things that are both dreaded and anticipated, where the waiting itself becomes a kind of pressure that builds without any particular incident feeding it. Hazel went about her work. She did the laundry for Ruth Dunbar and kept the boarding house books for Gertrude Blanche, and helped Cora Binns organize the school records and worked at Elmer Hatch's store for her 3 hours a week. She spoke to her mother in the evenings, carefully, keeping the shape of the difficulties without the weight of them, which was a skill she'd developed over years of protecting people who needed protecting. She saw Gideon twice that week before the gathering, both times briefly, once on the street, once when he stopped at the boarding house with a short piece of information about a road on the East Pass that had washed out and would affect the route to Ruth Dunbar's place. He'd found out and thought she should know. Those were the kinds of things he did, small, practical, entirely useful, and offered without ceremony. She'd stopped being surprised by them, which meant something. She had 2 conversations that week that stayed with her. The first was with her mother, Edna, who was having a good afternoon and was sitting in the boarding house kitchen with her tea and her hands in her lap, which was the position she took when she wanted to say something she wasn't sure how to say. "The Hale man," Edna said. Hazel looked up from the flowers she was measuring. "He fixed the hinge on the back door," Edna said. Hazel set the measuring cup down. "When?" "Tuesday morning, early. I saw him from the window." She paused. "I went out and said good morning, and he said good morning, and we looked at each other and I said thank you, and he said it needed doing." Edna wrapped both hands around her cup. "He has a quality about him." "I know." "The kind where you believe him." "I know, Mama." Edna was quiet for a moment. "I worry about you," she said. Not accusatory, matter of fact, the way she worried about everything, straight out and without apology. "This whole business with the town and the talking, I'm not as unaware as you all want me to be." Hazel didn't say anything. "I just want to know," Edna said, "if you're doing this because of him, or in spite of everything else." "Both," Hazel said. "Honestly, both." Edna nodded, like that was the answer she'd expected, and it was a good enough one. "Bring me more tea," she said, which meant the conversation was over. The second conversation was with Gideon, the evening before the gathering. He came by late, when the house was quiet, and she brought him coffee on the porch, and they sat in the cooling air with the spring night settling around them. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I don't do this kind of thing," he said, standing up in front of people and making statements. "I know. I want to be clear about that, not because I'm uncertain about it, because I want you to know what it costs me so you know I mean it." She held her coffee cup in both hands. The night was full of ordinary sounds, insects, a horse somewhere, the creek in the distance. "I know you mean it," she said. "Okay." He looked at the dark end of the street. "The gathering's at noon. Crawford Croft is going to be there. His wife. His daughter. I'll be there. You don't have to stand next to me." "Gideon," she looked at him. "I'm going to stand next to you." He looked back at her. In the porch dark, she couldn't read all of his expression, but enough of it. "Okay," he said. They finished the coffee. She went in. He walked home. Neither of them slept particularly well. The morning of the spring gathering was bright and windy. The kind of day Black Creek Ridge got in late May when the season had committed to warmth, but hadn't yet lost its edge. The central field between the church and the mill was set up with tables for food and long, rough benches for seating, and by 11 in the morning, a significant portion of the valley was already present. Homesteaders, ranchers, merchants, mill hands, the families from the Eastern Pass, even a few of the older settlers who didn't come into town for much else. Hazel arrived with Thomas. Not because she needed a companion. She was not someone who needed a companion to walk into difficult spaces. She brought Thomas because he'd asked to come, and because she understood what it meant to him to stand with her. The leg was good enough now that he barely used the stick. They moved through the crowd, and people spoke to them. Some warmly, some carefully, some in the brief and glancing way that meant they'd decided to wait and see which way things went before committing to a position. Ruth Dunbar found her immediately and embraced her with the brusqueness of a woman who'd decided her opinion before any of this and wasn't interested in revisiting it. Cora Binns gave her a small, sincere smile from across the field. Marjorie Croft saw her from 30 feet away and made no expression at all, which was its own kind of expression. Hazel talked to a farmer's wife she'd helped during the ice storm in January, when 2 of the woman's children had been sick and Hazel had sat up with them while the husband went for the physician. The woman held Hazel's hand and said quietly, "I haven't said enough. I'm saying it now. Thank you." You don't owe me anything, Hazel said.
No, the woman said.
But I want you to know I see what's happening and I think it's wrong. She walked away and Hazel stood there for a moment holding the weight of that. Gideon arrived from the north end of the field at 11:15. He came alone, which was how he always came to things, and he moved through the crowd in the way he moved through everything, unhurried, not performing ease, but not uncomfortable either. He found her with his eyes from across the field, and his expression didn't change, but he changed direction and came toward her. When he was beside her, he said, quietly enough that only she and Thomas could hear, "Crawford Croft is here, over by the hatch table. He's been watching since I came in." "I see him," she said. Thomas beside her was doing his careful face. "It'll be before the meal," Gideon said. "They do remarks before the meal, and I'll go then." She nodded. They stood together, not touching, not making a show of anything, just standing in the same piece of ground, which was enough for the people watching to read exactly what they needed to read. The gathering moved around them, and the conversations happened, and the food arrived at the tables. And then the settlement's informal council elder, a thin, dry-voiced man named Arthur Peel, stood at the center of the field and called for the gathering's attention. And Gideon Hale, who had not spoken in a public setting in Black Creek Ridge in the memory of most people present, waited for the remarks to open. Crawford Croft, across the field, watched him. Hazel stood very still and did not look afraid, because she had decided she was not going to be afraid, and she had made that decision this morning in front of the boarding house mirror with the full knowledge that she might need to remind herself of it before the day was out. She was not going to be afraid. Whatever came next, she was going to stand in it. Arthur Peel finished his remarks about the spring planting schedule and the creek allocation and the road repair fund with the dry efficiency of a man who had been running these gatherings for 20 years and had no interest in making them longer than necessary. He asked if anyone else had something to say before the meal, and he looked around the field the way he always did, expecting nothing, prepared for nothing. Gideon Hale raised his hand. The field went quiet in stages. First the people nearest to him, who saw it first. Then, like something spreading outward in water, the people at the edges. By the time Arthur Peel said Gideon, with the specific intonation of a man who was genuinely surprised, most of the gathering had already stopped talking. Gideon walked to the center of the field. He didn't hurry, and he didn't drag it out. He stood where Arthur Peel had stood, facing the assembled people of Black Creek Ridge, the ranchers and their wives, the mill families, the homesteaders from the Eastern Pass, the merchants, the people he'd grown up around and stayed apart from for the better part of 15 years, and he put his hat in his hands, and he spoke. "Most of you know me well enough to know I don't do this," he said. His voice carried without effort. It was a voice built for distance, for calling across mountain terrain and rough weather. "I'm not going to make a speech. I don't have the patience for it, and you don't need one." A few people shifted. Crawford Croft, from his position near the hatch table, had gone very still. "There's been a story going around this valley for the past 2 months," Gideon said, "about the Mercer family, about Hazel Mercer specifically. Most of you have heard it. Some of you have helped move it along." He didn't say this like an accusation. He said it like a fact, the same way he would have noted a broken fence line or a washed-out road. "The story says she's here for what she can get, that her family is a drain, that she's calculated about it, that what's between her and me is something she manufactured. He paused, looked at the field. "I've spent most of my life watching what people do when they think no one is paying attention," he said. "I've watched Hazel Mercer work harder than anyone in this settlement, with less help than she was owed, for 6 months. I've watched her manage a family through a hard winter, pick up income from nothing, sit up through the nights with a sick brother, and then turn around and help other people when they needed it, without being asked and without making a production of it." He stopped again. Something shifted in his jaw, the way it did when he was making himself say something that didn't come easily. "I'm not announcing a courtship because this crowd deserves the information," he said. "I'm announcing it because the people who've been trying to make her life in this valley smaller are going to keep doing it as long as they think it's going to work. And I want to be clear that it's not going to work." He put his hat back on. "That's all," he said, and walked back to where Hazel was standing. The gathering did not erupt. That was the first thing Hazel registered. She'd been braced for noise, for the specific, chaotic sound of a crowd that has received information it doesn't know how to handle. And instead, what she got was silence, and then the low, complicated murmur of 200 people beginning to process something at the same time. Gideon came back and stood beside her. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the field, at the faces sorting themselves into expressions. Thomas, on her other side, exhaled a breath he'd been holding for some time. "Well," he said quietly. "Well," Hazel said. Then she looked at Gideon. He turned to look at her at the same moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he'd done something that cost him and wasn't going to explain the cost. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly. "I didn't do it as a favor." She understood what he meant. She nodded. Crawford Croft had not moved from his position near the hatch table. From 40 feet away, Hazel couldn't read his expression with precision, but she could read the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had been surprised and was not accustomed to the sensation and was deciding what to do about it. Marjorie Croft beside him was not still at all. She was speaking to her husband in a low, urgent way, which meant he hadn't entirely prepared her for the possibility of this development, and she was renegotiating her position in real time. Eleanor Croft was looking at Gideon Hale with an expression Hazel couldn't entirely categorize. Not heartbreak. She'd been right about that. Eleanor had never actually wanted him. Something closer to wounded dignity, which was its own thing, and not entirely unsympathetic, even now. Arthur Peel cleared his throat and said it was time for the meal, and the gathering lurched back into motion with the grateful unanimity of people who had been given an acceptable thing to do at. The meal was its own kind of theater. People who had been carefully avoiding Hazel found reasons to cross her path. Some of them were genuine. The farmer's wife from earlier stayed close and introduced her to 2 homesteading families from the north edge of the valley that Hazel hadn't met. Cora Binns came and sat beside her for a portion of the meal and talked about the school records project with the comfortable normality of someone who had already decided where she stood and found the decision unremarkable. Other approaches were less genuine. People who came to make conversation mostly to see what Hazel was like now that she'd been publicly claimed, now that the shape of the situation had changed and they needed to update their calculation. She was polite to all of them. She wasn't warm where she didn't mean it, but she was polite. Ruth Dunbar found her during the meal and said, without preamble, "Good man." Took him long enough to say it out loud. "It hasn't been that long," Hazel said. "Felt long from where I was standing," Ruth said, and went to get more food. Gideon, for his part, moved through the gathering the way he always did. Not socializing exactly, but available. He spoke to a few homesteaders, had a brief exchange with Elmer Hatch that seemed to be about something practical, and circled back to Hazel's general vicinity without making it look like he was orbiting her, which she appreciated. What did not happen was Crawford Croft coming to speak to either of them. He ate his meal on the far side of the field, spoke to the people in his usual circle, and left the gathering 20 minutes before it concluded, with his wife and daughter following close. He did not look in Hazel's direction when he left, which meant Hazel understood that this was not over. It was simply relocated, plus him. The days immediately following the gathering were strange in a different way than the days before it had been. The organized pressures, the whisper campaign, the lost customers, the conversations that went quiet when Hazel entered a room didn't stop, but it changed texture. It became less confident. 2 of the people who had been most consistent about moving the Croft version of events around the settlement had been standing in that field when Gideon spoke, and something about being looked at directly by the man whose name they'd been using made them considerably less enthusiastic about continuing. Pearl Sadler came to the boarding house on a Thursday morning with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision they're embarrassed to have needed to make. She stood on the porch and said, without much preamble, that her husband had reconsidered and she wanted to know if the laundry arrangement was still available. Hazel looked at her for a moment. Pearl Sadler was 23 and not a bad person. She was a person who had followed the path of least social resistance and was now standing on Hazel's porch trying to find her way back to something better without having to fully account for where she'd been. Hazel could have made it harder for her. The temptation was real. "Tuesday pickup," she said instead. "Same terms as before." Pearl exhaled. "Thank you," she said. "Don't be late with the bundle," Hazel said. "Tuesday morning, before 10. Pearl nodded and left, and Hazel went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, aware that being decent when she didn't feel like it was its own kind of labor, and that nobody was going to credit her for it. Crawford Croft moved on the water rights in the first week of June. Gideon came to the boarding house on a Monday evening and told her plainly. He'd received a formal notice through the settlement's land record office, a document asserting that the private agreement governing the water allocation on his Upper Ridge property was not properly recorded and therefore not legally binding, and that the Croft cattle operation intended to submit a formal claim. It was a declaration of war dressed in legal language, and both of them knew it. "How bad is it?" she asked. "It's manageable," he said. "I'd need to hire a land agent to make the counterfiling, which costs money and time. And during the period of dispute, I can't use the water allocation the way I normally would, which limits what I can do with the Upper Ridge in the summer." She was quiet for a moment. "This is because of the gathering." "Yes." "Gideon, don't," he said, quietly. "Don't apologize for it. This is Crawford Croft deciding to punish me for a choice I made. That's not your weight to carry. It's not about carrying weight. It's about whether I've made your life worse." He looked at her steadily. "You've made my life considerably less boring," he said. "That's not the same thing." She would have laughed, except the situation was too serious for it. Almost. A land dispute in a settlement full of hostile gossip is your definition of not boring, compared to what my winters usually look like? "Yes." He sat back in the chair. "I have a plan for the land agent. There's a man in Callaway who handles these things, and he owes me from a property survey I helped him with 2 years ago. It won't be free, but it won't be as bad as if I'd had to find someone without the existing relationship. What about the summer restrictions? I'll lose some income from the Upper Ridge grazing lease. I can cover it." He paused. "What I can't do is let it sit and allow Croft to establish the claim by default. That's what he's banking on. That the cost and inconvenience will make me decide it's not worth the fight." "He's wrong about that," she said. "Yes." Something settled in his expression. "He's wrong about that." Mom, the summer came in fast and hot that year. By mid-June, the valley had shrugged off the last of the spring mud and committed to something that felt more like punishment than season. The creek dropped. The eastern ridge turned from green to the specific dry yellow gold of a frontier summer that was going to require careful management of water and grazing. Black Creek Ridge was not a settlement that handled inconvenience peacefully. The heat made the existing tensions shorter. The water allocation arguments that came up every summer came up earlier and louder. Crawford Croft's land filing had put the broader question of water rights on the table in a way that affected more than just Gideon's property and the homesteaders on the Eastern Pass. Families who had their own concerns about summer grazing access were paying attention. Hazel was paying attention too, though not primarily to the legal situation. She was paying attention to the valley itself, to what the heat meant for families on the thinner margins, to the elderly man who lived alone at the edge of the settlement, whose well she'd noticed running low when she'd passed his place 3 times in the last 2 weeks, to the Dunbar homestead 3 miles east where Ruth Dunbar was managing the property, largely alone since her hired hand had left for better wages elsewhere. She mentioned the elderly man to Gideon on a Wednesday evening. His name was Harlan Price, and he was 71, and nobody had said anything about the well. Gideon went out to Price's place the following morning. He came back in the afternoon and told her the well needed re-drilling, which was a project, but that for the immediate term he'd arranged to have water brought from his own supply twice a week. "Did he let you?" she asked, because Harlan Price had the reputation of a man who didn't accept help without argument. "Took some talking," Gideon said. "What did you say to him?" A pause. "I said you were worried about him, and that if I didn't come back with a solution, you'd come yourself and he'd find that harder to refuse." She looked at him. "You used me." "I mentioned you," he said. "It worked." She thought about being annoyed at that and found she couldn't quite manage it. "Is he all right otherwise?" "He's fine. Stubborn. He had 3 rabbits in a trap and he fed me lunch and told me about every winter he'd survived on this ridge going back 40 years. Took 2 hours. He said this without complaint, which meant he hadn't minded. She thought about Gideon Hale, the man everyone in Black Creek Ridge described as solitary and hard and uninterested in other people's business, sitting in Harlan Price's kitchen for 2 hours while the old man told his stories. "You're different than people think you are," she said. People think what's convenient for them, he said. I mean it. He looked at her. I know you mean it, he said. I'm not arguing with you. The situation with Crawford Croft resolved itself partially in a way nobody had anticipated. It was Elmer Hatch who brought Gideon the information on a Saturday morning in late June. He'd heard it from a land agent passing through from Callaway, the same man Gideon had contacted about the filing, who had mentioned in the course of a conversation about Black Creek Ridge's property landscape that Crawford Croft had filed a similar challenge against 2 other properties in the last 18 months. Both times, the challenges had eventually been withdrawn after the property owners had made concessions unrelated to the original water rights question. It was a pattern. Croft used the legal filing as pressure, not as a genuine claim. He didn't want the water rights. He wanted compliance. It's leverage, Gideon said when Elmer told him. He was not surprised. He was something closer to clarified. What are you going to do? Elmer asked. Not comply, Gideon said, and make sure he knows I know the pattern. He sent a letter to Crawford Croft through the Land Record Office, formal, factual, written with the help of the Callaway agent. It laid out the counter-documentation for the water rights, noted the 2 previous Croft challenges and their outcomes, and stated plainly that Gideon Hale intended to pursue the filing to full resolution rather than withdrawal, at whatever cost in time and money that required. It was the legal equivalent of a man who refuses to blink. Crawford Croft did not respond directly. What he did, 3 weeks later, was file a withdrawal of the water rights challenge. No explanation, no conversation, just the document, processed through the land office, returning the situation to the status it had occupied before June. Gideon told Hazel about it over coffee, on her porch. He told it plainly, without drama. The Callaway agent had confirmed receipt. The filing was closed. She sat with that for a moment. He backed down. He found out it wasn't going to be cheap or quick, Gideon said. The kind of man he is. He doesn't fight when fighting costs him more than staying put. What does that mean for the rest of it? It means his best tool just failed, Gideon said. He can keep the social pressure going, and he probably will for a while. But the thing he was holding over me is gone, and he knows I'll go the distance if he tries something else. Most men like that lose interest when the other person stops flinching. Hazel thought about this. She thought about the months of it, the lost customers, the whispers, the alley conversation, the patient accumulation of small discouragements. It's not over, she said. Not entirely. But the shape of it has changed. She looked at him. The summer light was long in the evening, gold and a little harsh, and it caught the lines of his face in a way that made him look exactly what he was. A man who had worked hard and lived in difficult conditions and had arrived at something approaching middle age without a lot of illusions left about anything. You didn't flinch, she said. Neither did you, he said. She thought about Pearl Sadler on the porch. The morning after the gathering, when she'd walked into the general store and 3 people had spoken to her, where 2 months ago they'd gone quiet. The farmer's wife who'd held her hand. The gradual, imperfect, incomplete shift in how the valley was holding her. It wasn't vindication exactly. It wasn't resolution. It was just the slow change of a tide that had been running against her for a long time, beginning, with no ceremony and no announcement, to run in a different direction. I want to ask you something, she said. He waited. The ridge. She looked at the end of the street. The property up there, is there room to build? The silence that followed was not an empty one. She was aware of what she was asking, not directly, but clearly enough that they both knew the direction of it. She wasn't asking about his property for administrative reasons. Gideon set his coffee cup down on the porch rail. He looked at the same end of the street she was looking at. The south-facing section, he said. There's a flat piece there, good drainage, morning sun. I've thought about it. You've thought about building there. I've thought about a lot of things, he said. Recently? Since February, he said. Give or take? She absorbed that. February. Since the store, almost. Since the morning she'd said thank you for the firewood, and he'd said he didn't know what she was talking about. I'm not asking you to build anything right now, she said. I'm asking if it's something you're considering. Yes, he said, simply. No ornamentation. Then I'm considering it too, she said. The summer dark came in around the porch, soft and warm and full of insects, and below them the settlement went about the ordinary business of its evening, Lights in windows, voices at distances, the sound of the creek running lower than it should, but running still. What happened in July, nobody saw coming. Not Hazel, who was good at anticipating things. Not Gideon, whose instincts for danger had kept him alive through 15 winters in the high country. Not Thomas, who had been watching the valley's moods like a man reading weather. The fire started on the eastern ridge on a Thursday evening in the third week of July. It started small, a lightning strike, the kind that hit the high dry timber without announcing itself and caught in the bone-dry summer brush before anyone on the valley floor knew there was anything to worry about. By the time the first person noticed the smoke line against the evening sky, it was already more than a small fire. By midnight, it was a catastrophe. The wind came down from the north overnight and drove the fire southwest with a speed that caught every calculation of the settlement's experienced men completely wrong. By 2 in the morning, the glow was visible from every point in the valley. By 4, the first homestead on the eastern pass was burning. Hazel heard it before she saw it, a sound she didn't recognize initially, something between the wind and something that was not the wind. She got up in the dark and looked out the window, and the eastern sky was orange. She was out of her nightclothes and dressed in the time it took most people to fully wake up. She went through the boarding house and got Thomas up, got Gertrude up, got the children organized. She did it without raising her voice, which was harder than it sounds. She knew what panic in a building full of children cost in time and clarity, and she didn't allow it. Get dressed, she told each child. Boots, coat, don't leave anything, don't go back for anything, come downstairs when you're ready. She was already thinking about the Eastern Pass families, about how many homesteads were in the fire's path, about the old man Harlan Price, who lived alone at the edge of the settlement, about Ruth Dunbar, 3 miles east, with no hired hand and no one near enough to raise an alarm in time. Thomas appeared at the bottom of the stairs already dressed. He looked at her face and understood immediately that she was already planning. "What do you need?" he said. "Horses," she said. "Who can we get horses from that fast?" "Curtis Webb owes us nothing, but Sam might—" "Go," she said. He went. She went to find Gideon. She found him already awake. Gideon's cabin was on the near edge of the ridge property, close enough to the settlement that the orange sky had pulled him out of sleep the same way it had pulled her. He was on his porch with his boots on, and his rifle leaned against the rail when she came up the path, and he took one look at her face and said, "How bad?" "Eastern Pass is burning. At least one homestead already. The wind shifted north." She was breathing hard from the walk, but her voice was even. "Ruth Dunbar is 3 miles out with no one nearby. Harlan Price is alone at the edge of settlement. There are families on the pass road who won't know until the smoke reaches them." He was off the porch and moving before she finished the sentence. "Thomas?" "Getting horses from the livery. Sam Webb was there overnight. He'll help." "I'll take the pass road," Gideon said. "There are 4 homesteads between here and the Dunbar place. I know the families." "I'll stay in the settlement," she said. "Someone has to organize where people go when they come in. The mill's the strongest building. If we can get the families there with their animals—" "The mill's too close to the eastern tree line," he said. He stopped and looked at her. "The creek side of the settlement, the Blanche property and the 2 houses west of it. Stone foundations. Fire won't jump the creek if we keep it managed." She processed this quickly. "How many people can those buildings hold?" "Between them, 80, maybe 100 if it's tight. There are more than 100 people on the Eastern Pass." "I know." He looked at the orange sky. It had grown in the time they'd been talking. "Get the close families to the creekside first. I'll drive the pass road and bring everyone I can find. We'll figure the rest when I get back." She grabbed his arm before he turned, not to stop him, to make him look at her for one more second. "Harlan Price first," she said. "He won't leave on his own." "I know," he said. "I know that." He left at a run toward the livery. For sure, the settlement woke in stages. Some people woke to the smell of smoke, which arrived before the visible fire as a thick, wrong quality to the night air. Some woke to the sound of horses and shouting as Gideon and 2 other men Thomas had roused went north up the pass road. Some woke to Hazel Mercer knocking on their doors at 4:30 in the morning with a calm that was the most frightening thing about the situation, because people who live near disaster know that the calm ones are the ones who understand what's coming. She went door to door on the south end of Sutton Street and then on Millbrook Road, delivering the same information each time. Fire on the eastern ridge, wind pushing it southwest. Bring your animals and anything you can carry in one trip, move to the creek side of the settlement, go to the Blanche property and the houses beside it. She didn't embellish and she didn't soften it, because the time spent managing someone's panic response was time she didn't have. Some people opened their doors half asleep and needed saying twice. She said it twice. Some people wanted to argue about whether it was really that serious. She looked at the eastern sky and pointed without speaking, and that was usually enough. By 5:30 in the morning, the Blanche property was filling. Gertrude Blanche, who had seen 2 bad fires in her 31 years in the valley and had survived both of them by being organized before the situation required it, had opened every room in the boarding house and was directing people with the authority of someone who owned the ground she stood on. Edna Mercer was in the kitchen with 2 of the other older women, making food from whatever was on hand, because people in crisis still needed to eat, and women who had fed families through hard times understood this without being told. The children, all the children, not just the Mercer ones, were put in the back rooms on the creek side of the house, away from the eastern windows. Will, the oldest at 11, had appointed himself responsible for keeping them there, and was doing it with a seriousness that would have made Hazel proud if she'd had time to notice. She was outside in the street managing the arriving families. It was not graceful work. Nothing about a mass evacuation in the dark is graceful. There were animals that didn't want to move and arguments about what to carry, and a family from the Eastern Pass who arrived with their wagon so overloaded that 2 of its wheels gave out on Sutton Street and had to be unloaded on the spot, which blocked the road for 20 minutes, while Hazel helped redistribute the load across 2 other wagons and got the whole mess moving again. A woman named Clara Jessup arrived with 4 children and no husband. Her husband was further east, she said. She didn't know where he was. She was holding herself together with the particular stiffness of a woman who has decided not to fall apart yet, because there's no one to fall apart at. "He'll come in," Hazel said. "Gideon's on the pass road. He'll come in with whoever he finds." "You don't know that," Clara said. "No," Hazel said, "but Gideon knows every family on that road, and he won't come back without them." She met the woman's eyes. "Take your children to the boarding house. Give them to the woman inside with the gray braid. Her name is Edna, and she'll keep them calm. Then come back out and help me." Clara Jessup looked at her for a second. The stiffness shifted, not into relief, but into something more useful, purpose. "What do you need?" she said. "I need someone who knows which families are on the north section of the pass road." "I know all of them," Clara said. "Then you're the person I need," Hazel said. "Children first, then come back." But the fire crested the eastern ridge just before 6 in the morning. People who had been watching the orange glow on the horizon had been telling themselves it was still at a distance. When the actual fire line appeared above the tree ridge, visible flame, not just reflection, the telling yourself stopped being possible, and the crowd on the creek side of the settlement shifted from anxious to something raw. Hazel felt it. The change in the air when a group of frightened people tips toward panic is a physical thing, like a drop in pressure. She'd felt it in November when 2 of the Mercer family's horses had gotten loose in a storm, and the children had started crying all at once. That specific frequency of collective fear that meant someone needed to be louder than the noise. She climbed onto the side rail of a stopped wagon and raised her voice. "Listen," she said, loud, direct, not asking. "The fire is on the ridge. It has not reached the valley floor. The wind is pushing it southwest, which means it's moving away from the settlement center. We have time." She didn't know for certain that last part, but she was looking at the fire line and making her best read. And her best read was that they had an hour before the situation changed significantly. Maybe less. Enough. "What I need is for everyone here to stop looking at the ridge and start being useful." She looked around the crowd. "Anyone with horses that aren't carrying a load, I need 2 riders to go north along the creek and check the irrigation channels. If those channels are running, we can use them to wet the ground between the fire line and the settlement. Anyone who knows how, now." 2 men stepped forward. She recognized one of them as a homesteader named Burr, who she'd done laundry for briefly and then lost as a customer. He didn't meet her eyes, but he stepped forward. "Burr," she said, "North Channel first, then circle back and tell me what you find." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was not something he'd have said to her 3 months ago, and neither of them had time to acknowledge it. She got off the rail and kept moving. Gideon reached Harlan Price's place at 20 minutes past 5. The old man was on his porch watching the eastern sky with the expression of someone who had seen serious things before and was taking the measure of this one. He had 2 horses in the yard, already bridled, and a canvas bag on the porch step. Gideon pulled up and looked at him. "You're ready." "Been ready since 4, Harlan said. "Was wondering when someone was going to show up." He picked up the bag. "She sent you, didn't she? The Mercer woman." "She mentioned you." "Figured." Harlan went to the first horse. He was 71 and he moved like it, but he got himself up without help, which had probably been important to him. The Kemper family is a quarter-mile north, 3 children. The wife is expecting. "I know," Gideon said. "They're next." They rode. The pass road in the pre-dawn with the fire smell getting stronger was a particular kind of bad. The horses didn't like it. Gideon's mare kept wanting to veer south, which was her instinct and not wrong, and he kept her on the road by main strength and talked to her in the low, specific way he talked to animals when they needed managing. The Kemper family was not ready. They were awake, but they were in the middle of the specific paralysis that hits people when a disaster arrives before they've mentally prepared for it. Standing in their own kitchen, surrounded by belongings they couldn't decide whether to take, the wife in the condition Harlan had described, the 3 children dressed and waiting in the corner with the look of children who had been told to be quiet and were being extremely quiet. Gideon had approximately 3 minutes of patience for the paralysis. "Leave it," he said from the door. "Take the children and whatever's already packed. The wagon, not the furniture, out in 2 minutes." "My wife can't," Martin Kemper started. "She can ride in the wagon. I'll drive it. You ride your horse." He looked at the wife, whose name he thought was Agnes. "Can you get to the wagon?" Agnes Kemper, who was 8 months along and had approximately no patience left for anything, said, "If someone helps me down the steps." They were on the road in 4 minutes. Gideon drove the Kemper wagon with Agnes and the children in the back and Martin riding alongside, and Harlan Price rode beside him with the quiet of an old man who had decided not to spend his remaining energy on anxiety. They picked up 2 more families on the pass road before the smoke became thick enough to make the horses genuinely unmanageable. The second family, a couple named Hadley, in their 50s, without children but with 4 dogs and a crate of chickens that complicated everything, took longer than they should have because Willis Hadley wanted to go back for a strongbox he'd left in the barn. "Whatever's in it," Gideon said, "it's not worth the barn if the fire gets there while you're inside." "There's 7 years of savings in that box," Willis Hadley said. They looked at each other. Gideon got down from the wagon. "Where in the barn?" "Left side under the feed shelf. There's a loose board. Stay with the horses." He went into the barn. He was out in 90 seconds with a metal box that was heavier than it looked. He handed it up to Willis Hadley without comment and got back on the wagon. Willis Hadley held the box in his lap for the entire ride into the settlement and didn't say much else, but when they pulled up on the creek side and Gideon helped Agnes Kemper down from the back, Hadley put a hand on his shoulder briefly, the kind of hand that means something without requiring words. The evacuation did not go perfectly. Evacuations never do. There was a period around 7 in the morning when 3 different groups of arriving families all needed the same piece of space at the same time, and the resulting tangle of wagons and horses and people and animals in the Blanche property yard was close to becoming a genuine crisis. A cow got loose and took 20 minutes to recover, during which it kicked a fence post hard enough to break it. A child got separated from her family for 45 minutes and was found by Cora Binns sitting calmly under the general store's overhang, eating a piece of bread she'd found, apparently unconcerned. A fire break attempt on the north end of Millbrook Road failed because the men who dug it had dug it too shallow, and the fire jumped it anyway, taking a corner outbuilding and half of an adjacent fence line before 3 men with wet blankets and bucket lines managed to beat it back. Hazel was in 5 places at once, and she did not manage to be in enough of them. She was on the south end of the creek organizing the irrigation channel water when someone came running to tell her there was a family still on the east road, a family nobody had accounted for, new homesteaders who'd arrived in the spring and hadn't been mapped into anyone's mental picture of who lived where. She sent Thomas on the fastest horse they had left. He came back 20 minutes later with a man, a woman, and 2 children behind him. And the children were coughing from smoke, and one of the horses had a burn on its flank from an ember that had carried far enough to be alarming. The family was shaken, but whole. Thomas pulled up beside Hazel and looked at the burn on the horse with an expression that didn't hide what he was thinking. "How far is the fire line?" she asked. "Half a mile from the East Road junction," he said. "Moving slower now. The wind dropped a little in the last hour, but it's not done." "The Dunbar property?" He shook his head. "I couldn't get that far. The road was closed by smoke." She stood with that for a moment. Ruth Dunbar, 3 miles east, alone. She looked at the eastern sky, which was a color that was not natural and never would be. And she thought about a 68-year-old woman who had told her not to let Marjorie Croft decide who she was. "I'm going," she said. Thomas grabbed her arm. "Hazel, the road." "I know the road." She turned and looked at her brother with everything she couldn't afford to feel right now pressed down behind her eyes. "If I go around the north field and cut through the creek channel, I can come at the Dunbar place from the west. The fire's moving southwest, which means it's moving away from that approach." "You don't know that for certain." "Thomas." She looked at him. "She's alone." He let go of her arm. He was her younger brother, and he knew her. And he knew that there was no sentence he could say next that would change the outcome. "Take the gray horse," he said. "She's got more left in her than the roan." Gideon came back into the settlement at 7:20 with the last of the Pass Road families and found Thomas Mercer on the street with the particular expression of a man standing where he would be most visible to someone returning from the east. "Where is she?" Gideon said. Thomas told him. Gideon said a word under his breath that he wouldn't have said in front of a woman, turned his horse, and went east. He met her on the Northfield track, coming back. She was riding the gray horse, and Ruth Dunbar was behind her on a brown gelding that Hazel had apparently convinced Ruth to take from her own stable, which meant she'd gotten to the Dunbar place and gotten the woman out, which meant the west approach had held. The smoke behind them was thick and yellow-white in the morning light, and both horses were moving with the particular urgency of animals that don't need to be told to go faster. Gideon pulled up alongside them and looked at Hazel. She was covered in ash and her eyes were red from smoke, and she was holding the reins with both hands because the gray horse was nervous and pulling. She looked at him when he came alongside and she said, without preamble, "The barn's gone." "Ruth's barn?" "Yes. We got the animals out, but the structure caught while we were moving them." She glanced back at Ruth Dunbar, who was riding with the grim, focused expression of a woman managing loss in real time. "She's all right. She's going to say she's all right, and she's going to mean it, and she's still going to need time." Gideon pulled alongside Ruth Dunbar. The older woman looked at him with reddened eyes. Smoke, not tears, though the line between them was close. "The heifers?" he said, because Ruth Dunbar was a practical woman, and the practical question would help her more than the sympathetic one. "Hazel got them to the north field," Ruth said. Her voice was steady. "3 of them. Lost the hay shed, too." "Hay shed I can fix before winter," he said. She looked at him. "I know you can," she said. "Don't make promises yet. Let's get off this road." They rode back to the settlement. By noon, the fire had pulled back from the valley floor, not because it had burned out. It was still running in the high timber, orange lines visible from the settlement when the smoke shifted. But the wind that had driven it southwest dropped in the mid-morning to something manageable, and the combination of the irrigation channel efforts, the fire break that had partially held on the north end, and the simple geography of the creek creating a natural barrier had kept the settlement itself from the worst of it. 3 outbuildings on the eastern edge were gone. 2 fence lines. An equipment shed. The Kemper barn had caught on the rear section and lost half its roof. No houses, no people. Nobody in Black Creek Ridge had died. That fact settled over the settlement in the early afternoon like something being set down. A weight that had been carried for 8 hours finally released. Hazel was sitting on the ground at the edge of the Blanche property when the tension broke in her. Not dramatically. She didn't collapse or weep. She sat down against the stone foundation wall of the boarding house with her knees up and her hands on her knees, and she breathed for several minutes without standing back up. The smoke smell was in everything. Her throat hurt. She could feel the ash on her face and in her hair, and she was too tired to care about it. The smallest Mercer child, the girl who was 7 now, came and sat next to her without being asked. She leaned against Hazel's arm without saying anything, which was exactly right. Gideon found her there. He came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. He was worse off than she was. There was a burn on his left forearm, not serious but visible, and he was carrying smoke in his clothes and face the way she was, and there was a cut on his jaw from something he hadn't mentioned to anyone. He sat down on the ground beside her, on the other side from the child. They sat for a while without speaking. The settlement moved around them, people accounting for their animals, families reuniting, the particular sound of a community that has been through something together and is only now beginning to understand what it has been through. Ruth Dunbar's barn, Hazel said. We'll rebuild it, he said, before winter. She'll say she doesn't need help. She says a lot of things, he said. A small sound from Hazel that was almost a laugh. Almost. The child leaned heavier against her arm. Hazel put her arm around the girl without looking down. The Kemper family, she said. Agnes is fine. The baby held off. He paused. For now. Harlan Price? In the boarding house, eating your mother's cooking and telling anyone who'll listen that he knew the fire was coming 3 days ago from the way his horses were acting. Was he right? Probably, Gideon said. She exhaled, long, careful, letting some of the morning out. You went for Ruth yourself, he said. It was not an accusation. It was something that needed acknowledging. Thomas told you. When I came back. I knew the approach, she said. I know you did. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not angry. I need you to know that I'm not angry. She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead. You were scared, she said. Yes, he said, without qualifying it. She sat with that. A man who had spent 15 years alone in the high country, who did not soften things or perform feelings he didn't have, saying yes simply to being scared. I'm all right, she said. I know you are. He turned to look at her then. In the ash-filtered afternoon light, with the smoke still in the air and the settlement still sorting itself out around them, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the ridge in April, like she was something he'd decided about completely and wasn't going to reconsider. That's not the point. She held his gaze. What's the point? That you being all right doesn't mean I get to stop being scared, he said. Those are different things. She looked at him for a long time. The child between them had fallen asleep against her arm, the deep, sudden sleep of a young child who has been awake through a night of loud, frightening things and has finally decided it's safe to let go. Gideon, she said. The south-facing section, on the ridge. She kept her voice quiet so it was just between them. You said it had good drainage and morning sun. He went still beside her. When this is over, she said, when we've sorted the mess and helped the people who need help and gotten Ruth Dunbar's barn rebuilt, and Agnes Kemper's baby arrived safe, when things have settled enough. She looked at the sleeping child, the ash in the air, the stone wall of the boarding house that had held all her people through a hard winter and a harder summer. I'd like to see it properly, with that in mind. He didn't answer immediately. She was learning that about him, that the things that mattered most to him took longer to answer because he refused to answer them carelessly. Yes, he said, not elaborated, not decorated, just yes, in the way of a man who means the full weight of the word. She nodded once. The child slept on her arm. Around them, Black Creek Ridge was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, the long work of cleaning up after a disaster. And across the settlement, in the Blanche property yard, something was happening that neither of them saw in the moment but would hear about afterward from Gertrude Blanche, who had seen the whole thing from the boarding house porch. Crawford Croft, who had been one of the last to arrive at the creekside evacuation point, was standing near the edge of the crowd. His wife was with him. His daughter was with him. And a woman was crossing the yard toward him, not to confront him, not with any dramatic intention, just crossing from one side to the other on some errand. And it was Clara Jessup, whose husband Gideon had brought in from the pass road, and she was carrying one of her children on her hip, and she stopped in front of Crawford Croft and looked at him for a moment and said something. Gertrude Blanche couldn't hear what it was from the porch, but she saw Crawford Croft's face when Clara Jessup said it, and she saw him nod, slowly, with the particular heaviness of a man who is acknowledging something he has been managing not to acknowledge for a long time. Clara Jessup walked on. Crawford Croft stood in the yard of the settlement he had worked to control for 20 years, with the smoke of the fire that Hazel Mercer had helped organize the response to still in the air above him, and he looked at nothing in particular. He looked like a man doing a calculation that was coming out different than he'd expected. The cleanup began the morning after the fire and did not end quickly, because nothing worth rebuilding ever does. The first week was the hardest kind of work. Not dramatic, not the adrenaline labor of crisis, but the slow, grinding, detail-oriented work of assessing what was lost and figuring out what could be salvaged and in what order. Gideon organized the men on the Eastern Pass properties, moving between sites with the practical authority of someone who understood construction and didn't waste time on things that couldn't be fixed. The Kemper barn roof was the first priority. Agnes Kemper was 10 days from her due date, and the family needed the structure sound before the weather turned. It took 4 days and the help of 6 men, and it was not a beautiful job, but it held. Hazel organized everything else. This was not a role anyone assigned her. It was a role that assembled itself around her because she was the person who showed up with the information already sorted. Which families needed food, which needed materials, which needed labor, which needed someone to sit with them for an hour while they processed what they'd lost without being told to feel better about it. She kept a running account in the brown paper ledger she'd started in November, the same one with the original $42 calculation, now filled front to back with numbers that told the story of a family finding its footing. She added new columns for the fire relief. Gertrude Blanche watched this from her kitchen window one morning and said to Edna, who was peeling potatoes at the table, "Your daughter is going to run this valley in 10 years. Edna didn't look up from the potatoes. "She could run it now," she said. "She just doesn't want to." That was not entirely accurate. What Hazel wanted was more specific than running anything. What she wanted was for people to have what they needed, and for the work of getting it to them to be recognized as work, real, skilled, unglamorous work, rather than the natural extension of a certain kind of woman's nature. She'd watched her whole life while capable women were thanked for their helpfulness, without anyone acknowledging that helpfulness, applied at scale and under pressure, was not a personality trait, but a professional competency. She was done being thanked for her nature. She intended to be recognized for her work. Crawford Croft came to the boarding house on the 5th day after the fire. He came alone, which Hazel noted. No wife, no intermediary, no buffer of any kind. He knocked on the front door at 9 in the morning, and when Gertrude Blanche answered, he asked, with a formality that was not natural to him but which he was making the effort of, whether Miss Mercer was available. Gertrude Blanche looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Hazel was in the kitchen. She came out when Gertrude appeared in the doorway with an expression that conveyed the situation without words. She wiped her hands on a cloth and walked to the front room. Crawford Croft was standing in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands. He was a large man, well-dressed, with the particular bearing of someone who had been the most powerful person in most rooms for long enough that standing in a room where he wasn't felt physically uncomfortable. He looked uncomfortable now. Not ashamed exactly. She didn't think he was built for shame in the conventional sense, but something adjacent, recalibrated. She stood across the room from him and waited. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Croft." He looked at her for a moment. He was taking her measure the way men like him do, not to find weakness, because he'd already determined she didn't have the kind of weakness he knew how to use, but to find the appropriate register. The way you speak to someone you've been wrong about requires a different calibration than the way you speak to someone you've successfully managed. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. Finally. Like it had been sitting in him for days and he'd decided to get it out. She didn't say anything. "What you did during the fire," he said. "The organization of it, the families you got out, the Dunbar woman." He stopped. "Clara Jessup's husband came in on the pass road because Gideon Hale was out there looking for every family. But it was you who sent him." "I knew who was out there," she said simply. "You knew?" "Yes." He turned his hat once in his hands, an unconscious movement. "My family was not at risk the way the pass road families were. We're west of the creek. He paused. "I didn't go out to the pass road." "No," she said. He absorbed that, the acknowledgement that she'd noticed, that she was not going to pretend she hadn't. "I've been told," he said, "that Clara Jessup said something to me in the yard, after. I expect you've heard what she said." Hazel had heard. Gertrude Blanche had told her within an hour of it happening. Clara Jessup had said, "If it wasn't for Hazel Mercer, my children would have been on that road without anyone knowing they were there." And she'd said it quietly, without drama, looking Crawford Croft in the face. "I've heard," Hazel said. "It was accurate," Crawford Croft said. She waited again. He exhaled through his nose. "The water rights filing," he said. "I withdrew it." "I know. Gideon told me. I want to tell you directly that it was a misuse of the process." He said this like it cost him, but like he'd decided the cost was necessary. "I used it as a pressure mechanism. That was wrong." Hazel stood in the front room of Gertrude Blanche's boarding house and looked at Crawford Croft, who had spent 6 months making her life in Black Creek Ridge considerably harder than it needed to be. And she thought about what she wanted from this moment. She didn't want his guilt. Guilt was his to manage. She didn't want an apology that was really a performance of remorse intended to relieve the performer. What she wanted was specific. "The families on the Eastern Pass Road," she said. 3 of them lost significant structures. The Kemper barn is being repaired, but the Hadley equipment shed and the fence lines on the north end of the Morrison property are going to require materials that those families can't cover on their own. Crawford Croft looked at her. "You have lumber on your west property," she said. "I've been told enough about the valley's resources to know that. You have more than you're using this season." A pause. He was not a man who was often directed by anyone. He was adjusting to the experience. "What else?" he said. "The Morrison family is going to lose their summer grazing lease if they can't repair the fence before the cattle need to move. They can't do it themselves in time. I need men, 4 of them, for 3 days. From my operation." "You have the hands to spare in late July," she said. "I've seen your grazing calendar. You rotate the South Pasture crew after the spring drive." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You've been paying attention to the valley." "Since November," she said. "It's what I do." Something crossed his face. Not quite respect. It was something more complicated than that, more grudging and more genuine at the same time. "The lumber and the labor," he said. "I can arrange that." "Good," she said. "Talk to Gideon about the materials list. He's coordinating the reconstruction." Crawford Croft put his hat back on. He looked at her for one more second, the look of a man updating a calculation he'd been wrong about for a long time, and knowing it, and not having anywhere to put that knowledge except forward. "I'm sorry for the trouble I caused your family," he said. It was not a sufficient statement for what he'd done. Both of them knew that. But it was an honest one, an honesty from a man who had not been in the habit of it where she was concerned counted for something. "Thank you for coming," she said. He left. Gertrude Blanche appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 3 seconds after the front door closed. She was holding a dish towel, and her expression suggested she had heard every word. "Well," she said. "Don't," Hazel said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something," Gertrude allowed a small, contained smile. "You handled that better than I would have," she said, which was as large a compliment as Gertrude Blanche gave anyone, and she went back to the kitchen. The Dunbar barn went up in the 3rd week of August. It was not a particularly elegant barn. It was built by a combination of homesteaders, mill hands, and Gideon Hale's labor across 6 days, using a mix of timber from Gideon's Ridge property and the lumber Crawford Croft had sent over on 2 wagons without announcement, driven by 4 of his hands who showed up on a Monday morning and told Thomas Mercer they were there to work and didn't need instruction. Thomas had looked at them for a moment. Then he'd put them on the east fence line of the Morrison property and told them the corner post needed to go in before anything else. The barn raising was the kind of work that doesn't look like community repair until you're standing in the middle of it. People arrived with food, with tools, with their particular skills and their willingness to put them next to someone else's. The Kemper family came, Agnes walking slowly with the new weight of a baby 3 weeks old. A girl arrived without complication on a Tuesday morning in the 1st week of August, named May. Harlan Price came and sat on a stump for most of the day, supervising without authority and being listened to more than he expected. The school teacher Cora Binns came on her half-day and helped with the children who'd come with their parents, keeping them from the construction site perimeter with a calm authority that would have impressed Hazel if Hazel hadn't already known Cora Binns was competent at everything she touched. Elmer Hatch came and worked a half-day and then had to go back to the store, but he came, which meant something. His wife Prudence came and stayed the whole day and brought enough pie for 3 times the number of people present, which was typical of Prudence Hatch, and why most of Black Creek Ridge was quietly fond of her despite Elmer's neutrality. Marjorie Croft did not come. Hazel hadn't expected her to, and she didn't hold it against her. Eleanor Croft came for an hour, brought preserves from her mother's kitchen, and spoke to Hazel briefly about nothing in particular with the specific careful politeness of a young woman who was working out how to exist in a situation that had rearranged itself around her. Hazel was not unkind to her, because Eleanor Croft was 22 years old, and hadn't chosen the role her family had cast her in, any more than Hazel had chosen the role Black Creek Ridge had cast her in. "The preserves are very good," Hazel said, because they were. Eleanor looked at her. "My mother made them," she said. Then a beat later, "I think she felt she should send something." Hazel received that for what it was. "Please thank her," she said. Eleanor nodded and left, and Hazel stood for a moment watching her go and thought about how many ways a person can be diminished by the expectations of people who love them, and how that was its own kind of hard that didn't get credited because it came from a position of privilege. The barn went up. Ruth Dunbar walked through it on the evening of the 6th day, touching the timber with both hands, checking the joints with the hands-on assessment of a woman who knew what she was looking for. She found a beam joint on the north wall that she said was going to need reinforcing before winter, and told the man who'd set it, a homesteader named Becker, that he'd need to redo it. Becker started to argue. Ruth Dunbar looked at him. He redid the joint. When the barn was done, Ruth stood outside it in the long August evening light and looked at it without saying anything for a while. Hazel stood beside her. They'd been doing this, standing in comfortable proximity without needing to fill it with words, since the morning of the fire, since the west approach through the smoke and the animals pulled out of the burning shed and the ride back with the orange sky behind them. "Thank you," Ruth said. "Not for the barn specifically, for all of it." "You told me not to let someone else define me," Hazel said. "That mattered." Ruth made a sound. "I told you that, and then you rode into a smoke-choked field to get me out. I suppose we're even." "We're not keeping score," Hazel said. "No," Ruth said. "We're not." In September, Gideon took her to the south-facing section of the ridge. He'd mentioned it once since the fire, briefly, asking if she still wanted to see it. She'd said yes. They'd both been too consumed with the reconstruction work to give it more than a sentence, which was fine. The things they were most certain about didn't require constant maintenance. She'd been up the trail before, the first time in April when he'd shown her the view of the valley. This was different. They went further east along the ridgeline, past the area she knew, through a stretch of timber that was older and quieter, the kind of quiet that made you adjust your own volume without deciding to. The south-facing section was exactly what he'd described, a flat shelf of land protected on the north by the ridge itself, with a view down into the valley that was slightly different from the one she'd seen before. Closer to the creek, able to see the settlement's main street from above, and facing the morning sun so that you'd get light early and warmth through the cold months. She stood on it for a long time. It was not a beautiful piece of land in the frontier story sense. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't a mountaintop or a river overlook, or any of the things that got described in settlement stories. It was a practical, well-situated, solid piece of ground. It had drainage and sun and shelter and access. And it was quiet without being remote. And it looked down at the valley with the perspective of something that had been here long before the settlement and would be here long after. "You've already drawn it out," she said. Not a question. "In my head," he said. "Not on paper yet." 2 rooms to start. The kitchen on the south side for the morning light. He was quiet for a moment. "The kitchen on the south side," he agreed. She turned to look at him. He was watching her in the way he had on the porch in April, in the way she'd been collecting since February. That specific quality of attention that had nothing performative in it, nothing that was asking her to be anything other than exactly what she was. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "All right. I'm not coming here because of what happened in the valley, the fire, the Crofts, the way things shifted. I'm not coming here because it became easier." She looked at the land and then back at him. "I was going to say yes to this before any of that. I want you to know that." He looked at her steadily. "I know that," he said. "I know you know it. I wanted to say it out loud anyway." He nodded once. Then, I'm also not asking because things got easier. I was going to ask. He paused in his particular way. I was working toward it before the fire. I had a specific conversation planned. She raised an eyebrow. Gideon Hale was planning a specific conversation. I'm capable of planning things. What did the planned conversation involve? He looked slightly pained. Fewer witnesses than I ended up with, he said.
She laughed. Actually laughed. Not the almost laugh she'd managed in the hard months, but the real thing, full and unguarded. It surprised her, the sound of it. She'd forgotten it could come that easily. He watched her laugh with the look of a man who had decided he wanted to hear that sound for a long time and was not going to say so directly, which was entirely in character. Ask me now, she said, when she'd gotten it under control. There are no witnesses.
He looked at her for a moment. The ridge was quiet around them. The valley was below. September had turned the light into something gold and a little tired, the way the end of summer gets before it finally lets go. Come build this with me, he said. Not will you marry me in the formal construction. He wasn't a formal construction kind of man, and she wouldn't have believed it from him. Just come build this with me. Which meant all the things the formal version meant and several additional things that the formal version didn't have words for. She thought about November, the frozen barrel in the alley, the cold mud, the $42. She thought about the boarding house kitchen at 10 o'clock with the stub of pencil and the brown paper, making lists of what she could do. She thought about what it had felt like to arrive in a place that had already decided she wasn't enough, and to have to prove, day after day and without acknowledgement, that it was wrong. She thought about a man who left firewood before dawn without wanting credit for it, who sent maps to a schoolhouse without signing his name, who told her she was telling the truth the way other people said good morning, without effort, without ceremony, because it was simply what was true. Yes, she said. It was the same word she'd said on the ridge in April, and it meant something bigger now, and they both knew it, and neither of them made a production of it. They stood on the south-facing shelf of Gideon Hale's ridge property in the September light, and the valley below them went about its business, and the moment was what it was. Not cinematic, not perfect, just two people who had chosen each other through a hard year and meant it. They built through the fall. This was not a metaphor. They actually built, Gideon and Thomas and two hired men from the settlement, with materials that came from 3 different sources, including Crawford Croft's lumberyard, which had submitted a fair invoice rather than a gift, which was the version of things Hazel had insisted on. She didn't want charity from Crawford Croft. She wanted commerce, conducted at proper distance, which was both more dignified and more durable. The foundation went in September, the framing in October. By the time the first snow of the season came down in early November, exactly a year, almost to the week, after the Mercer family's wagon had rolled into Black Creek Ridge on a cracked axle, the shell of the house was standing. It wasn't finished. It wouldn't be finished until spring, and there were things about it that would take longer than that. The kitchen was on the south side, as agreed. The main room was larger than Gideon had originally planned, because Hazel had looked at the original drawing and said flatly that it wasn't big enough for the people who were going to use it, by which she meant her mother and Thomas and the children and Ruth Dunbar and Cora Binns and Gertrude Blanche and Harlan Price and the Kempers and the Jessups and anyone else who needed a place to be. Gideon had looked at the revised drawing for a moment and said nothing and had the framing adjusted. Thomas's situation had resolved in its own way by October. He'd been working with Royce the carpenter through the summer, first on Royce's regular projects, then on the fire reconstruction work, where his precise measuring and his ability to think 3 steps ahead of a structural problem had turned out to be genuinely valuable. Royce had offered him a partnership arrangement in September, not charity, not accommodation, but a recognition that Thomas Mercer's skills and Royce's established client base together were worth more than either was separately. Thomas had come home that evening and told Hazel, and she had hugged him in the way siblings hug when the relief is too large for words. "Don't make a thing of it," he said into her shoulder. "I'm not," she said, and held on for another moment anyway. Edna had her good months and her bad months, as she always would. The bad ones were harder now that Hazel had space to notice them. The compressed winter had required her to triage everything, including her own worry, and now that the compression had eased, the worry had room to expand. "But doctor," Cole had come through again in September and confirmed that Edna's lungs were holding and that the warmer climate of the boarding house had been better for her than the drafty situation they'd been in before. He said so plainly and without sentimentality, which was how Hazel preferred to receive medical information. The children grew. Will turned 12 in October and had, somewhere in the course of the year, acquired the quiet confidence of a child who has seen adults manage difficulty without collapsing and has taken the lesson internally. He still brought home books from the schoolhouse and left them on the table. He'd started leaving them with notes in the margins, which meant he was beginning to have opinions, which Hazel considered the most hopeful sign she'd seen. The youngest girl, who was 7 and whose name was Lily, had appointed herself responsible for the relationship between Gideon Hale and the Mercer family's collective well-being, which in practice meant she spoke to him with the directness of someone who had decided he was trustworthy and was not going to pretend otherwise. She asked him questions other people didn't ask. She told him things about her day without being invited. She sat next to him at the table when he came for meals and told him about the horse at the livery that had been sick and was better now, and he listened to all of it with the seriousness he gave everything, which she responded to by telling him more. Hazel watched this and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. There's a thing that happens in small communities after a crisis. Not immediately. It takes months, sometimes longer. But eventually, the experience of having gone through something together creates a kind of shared reference point, a before and an after. People who are on opposing sides of a smaller argument find that the larger event has rearranged their priorities in ways they didn't choose but can't undo. Black Creek Ridge was not transformed by the fire in the way frontier stories sometimes suggest. Not suddenly enlightened, not uniformly improved, not clean and new and better on the other side. It was still a place with social hierarchies and old resentments and people who moved slowly toward admitting they'd been wrong. Marjorie Croft never came to Hazel's door. Some of the Whisper campaign participants quietly resumed their normal lives without ever acknowledging what they'd done, which was its own kind of cowardice that time did not entirely erase. But things had changed. The nature of the change was specific and real, and it showed up in practical ways. The Settlement's Informal Council, Arthur Peel's group of 6 men who managed the Valley's common decisions, added a 7th member in October. The addition was not dramatic. Arthur Peel had simply noted at a regular meeting that the fire response had revealed gaps in how the settlement organized crisis management and that these gaps had been addressed during the fire by an informal system that had worked better than the formal one. He proposed formalizing it. The other members agreed. The new role was called Settlement Coordinator, and it was described in Arthur Peel's characteristically dry language as responsibility for resource allocation, community welfare tracking, and emergency response organization. He had proposed Hazel Mercer for the role. She'd heard about it from Elmer Hatch, who had been at the meeting. He told her the way he told her most things, factually, without buildup. "You don't have to take it," he said. She'd thought about that for 24 hours. She'd talked to Gideon about it, which was not the same as asking his permission. He would have been confused if she'd framed it that way. But because he was the person she now thought things through with, and thinking things through with someone else was a different kind of thinking than thinking alone. "What do you want?" he'd asked. "I want it to mean something," she'd said. "Not a title that makes people feel they've done the right thing. Actual responsibility. Actual authority when I need it." "Then say that when you accept," he said. She accepted the role, and she said exactly that, in a meeting with Arthur Peel that lasted 40 minutes, and resulted in a written description of the coordinator's responsibilities that was specific enough to be useful, and had Hazel's corrections to Arthur Peel's original draft in the margins in her own handwriting. Arthur Peel had looked at the corrected draft and said, "Well, that's clearer." "Yes," Hazel said. "It is." The first snow came on a Wednesday in early November. Not heavy, just the first announcement, an inch that was gone by afternoon but left the air with the particular smell that meant winter was coming whether the valley was ready or not. Hazel stood at the window of the boarding house kitchen in the morning and watched it come down. The house on the ridge was standing in shell form, waiting for spring to be finished. Her family was distributed through the boarding house rooms in the arrangement that had become, over a year, something that felt like home. Thomas was at Royce's shop. The children were at school. Her mother was asleep still, which was the right thing for her on cold mornings. She thought about November a year ago. the cracked axle, the $42, the list of skills she could sell and the number of customers she'd need, and the way she'd sat at this exact table in the small hours and done the arithmetic of survival. The arithmetic had changed. Not because survival had become simple, it never did, and she understood now that it wasn't supposed to, that the people who thought security meant the end of difficulty were the people who fell apart when difficulty arrived anyway. But the margins were different. The ground beneath her was different. She heard boots on the porch and knew them before the door opened. Gideon came in out of the snow with his coat white at the shoulders and his face carrying the cold and the particular quality of a man who had been up early and working at something. He pulled off his coat and hung it, and she put a cup on the table without asking. He sat down. He looked at the window, at the snow. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "How's the framing holding?" she asked. She meant the ridge house. "Fine," he said. "I covered the south window openings. It'll be dry." She nodded. They sat for a while in the morning quiet. Outside, the snow continued, light and unhurried. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what this year has been." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I came here with nothing but the things I knew how to do. And the things I knew how to do turned out to be worth more than anyone here thought they were, including me, some days." She paused. "I used to think that if you just kept working and kept being honest and kept showing up, people would eventually see it. I believed in that." "And now?" he said. "And now I think that was partly right and partly naive." She looked at him. "People see what they're positioned to see. The Crofts weren't going to see me clearly because seeing me clearly would cost them something. Some of the people who repeated the stories about me weren't bad people. They were just people who took the easier path because the easier path was available. That doesn't make it forgivable, but it makes it something I understand." Gideon listened. "What actually changed things," she said, "wasn't that I proved myself. I was proving myself for 6 months, and it wasn't enough. What changed things was the fire. Something that forced everyone to be in the same crisis at the same time and made the question of who was actually useful impossible to avoid." She stopped. "I don't know how to feel about that. That it took a disaster." "It shouldn't have taken a disaster," he said. "No, it shouldn't have." She looked at the window. "But it's what happened, and I've been trying to decide whether I'm bitter about it." "Are you?" She thought about that honestly. "Some," she said. "Not as much as I expected. I think the bitterness requires me to believe that the people who misjudged me were doing something unique. But the truth is, people misjudge all the time. They categorize what they see and then they see the category. I've done it. I've looked at someone and decided what they were before I knew them." She paused. "I'm thinking about Harlan Price. When I first heard his name, I pictured an old man who would be a burden in a crisis. He had his horses ready at 4 in the morning. Gideon made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that vicinity. "The lesson isn't that people are good," she said. "The lesson is that people are more than what they look like from the outside, and that includes the people who are worse than they look, and the people who are better." She looked at him. "I'm trying to hold both of those at the same time, and not let the worse ones make me stop believing in the better ones." He was quiet for a moment. He set the cup down. "You're better at that than I am," he said. "You're getting there," she said. He looked at her with the corner of something in his expression. "Am I?" "You fed Harlan Price's chickens for 3 weeks without telling him," she said. "I am counting that as progress." "Sam Webb told you." "Sam Webb tells me everything." She paused. "You knew he would." He said nothing, which was its own answer. Outside, the snow had slowed to something almost imperceptible, flakes scattered and occasional, the storm deciding to hold most of itself for later. The valley was quiet with it. The settlement street outside the boarding house window was empty except for one figure moving south with a package, hurrying against the cold. "I want to ask you something," Gideon said. He was using the voice he used for things that mattered. A little slower, a little more deliberate, like he was making sure he said it right. "All right," she said. "The house will be finished by April, maybe May." He looked at the table. "I want to know what you see when you look at it." She understood what he was asking, not about the building's specifications, about what she imagined when she imagined them in it. "I see mornings," she said. "The kitchen light. I see Thomas coming over on Sundays because that's what we'll do. I see my mother in a chair that doesn't hurt her back. I see Lily with more books than she has room for." She paused. I see myself being useful in this valley in ways that have my name on them, not quiet and behind the scenes. Mine. She looked at him. And I see you, coming in from the ridge, sitting at the table the way you're sitting right now. She held his gaze. Is that the right answer? There's no wrong answer, he said. I know, she said. But is it the right one? He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, what was left of the snow came down in the last few quiet flakes before it stopped entirely. Yes, he said, simply, as he always said the things that mattered most to him. There are people who leave a mark on a place not because they were the loudest or the most powerful or the ones with the most to start with, but because they showed up when showing up was genuinely costly, and they kept doing what they did even when no one was crediting them for it. The Valley doesn't always know these people while they're working. Sometimes it takes a disaster. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes, if the community is lucky, it happens to see before it's too late to say so. Black Creek Ridge was not a changed place in the way stories sometimes want a place to be changed, all at once, completely, with some grand moral reconciled and everyone better for it. It was still a frontier settlement with all the complications that entailed, property disputes and gossip, and people who were petty and people who were generous, and the daily grind of survival that left everybody a little ragged at the edges. But something had shifted in the way the valley measured things. Before the winter, Black Creek Ridge measured people by what they owned, what they looked like, who their family was, and how well they fit the expectations of the people already in power. These are the measurements of a community that hasn't been tested yet. After the winter and the spring campaign and the gathering and the fire and the long work of rebuilding, there were enough people in the valley who had been in a room or on a road or in a yard and seen Hazel Mercer do something that mattered, that the old measurements didn't hold as cleanly. They'd been contaminated by evidence. Clara Jessup told the story of the evacuation to anyone who hadn't been there. Ruth Dunbar told people what the West approach through the smoke had looked like. Agnes Kemper, who had been in the back of a wagon on the pass road at 8 months along and had kept herself calm by focusing on the voice of the woman Gideon had said was organizing the evacuation. That woman, she told people, that woman didn't panic. She made everything seem manageable. I don't know how she did it, but she did. These stories traveled. They didn't erase the earlier ones. Old stories don't erase, they just get additional context, which is how memory actually works. But they added weight to a different side of the scale, and the scale gradually moved. Hazel Mercer did not require the scale to move. She'd stopped requiring anything from Black Creek Ridge's opinion of her sometime around the second month of the Whisper campaign, when she'd understood that requiring validation from a community that wasn't ready to give it was a form of self-harm she couldn't afford. What she'd worked for since then was not acceptance. She'd worked for her family's stability, for her own competency to be applied at the scale it was actually suited for, and for the specific future she was building on a south-facing piece of ridge property with morning sun and a kitchen that would see the light early. The acceptance when it came was beside the point. It was still real. It still mattered in the specific way that justice matters, even when it arrives late and incomplete. Because the person who deserved it, and the fact that it took longer than it should have doesn't change the fact that it happened. By the end of that year, Black Creek Ridge had a settlement coordinator whose name was on the office door of the land record building, and whose brown paper ledger had been replaced by a proper account book that Elmer Hatch had ordered from the city and presented to her without ceremony on a Tuesday morning, which was his version of a significant gesture. By spring, there was a house on the south-facing section of the ridge that smelled like fresh timber and wood smoke, and the particular combination of two people's lives beginning to occupy the same space. By summer, there would be a wedding, small, outdoors, at the edge of the ridge property where the valley was visible below, with the people who had actually shown up in the difficult months and no one invited for appearance's sake. Gideon Hale, standing on the ground he'd spent 15 years alone on, would look sideways at the woman beside him with the look that had started in a general store doorway in February and had not found a reason to stop since. Hazel Mercer. Settlement coordinator, laundry woman, bookkeeper, emergency organizer, bearer of $42, and a list of skills in November, and a considerably different list of things by the following summer, would look back at him, not with the relief of someone who had been rescued, with the quiet, grounded certainty of someone who had built something real in difficult ground with her own hands and had found another person willing to build beside her. That was the story the valley told afterward. And for once, it was accurate.